Chapter 559. It was said that there was a spring in the depths of the tomb. It was known as Sacred Spring of Life. It could give a person an opportunity to promote himself and make the breakthrough into the great sage realm. It wasn't guaranteed that it could help a person in making the breakthrough into the great sage realm. However, it would be great for these sage experts even if it could only give an opportunity to do so. After all, it was very hard to make the breakthrough into great sage realm. It could even be said that there was no guarantee that even one among 100 sage accomplished level experts could promote to the great sage realm. Therefore, even a 100th or 1,000th chance of promoting to the great sage realm was enough to make them go crazy. A person could become a top dog only after becoming a great sage. Tang Can had attracted a lot of attention toward himself since he possessed a map of this legendary tomb. It wasn't that nobody had ever gone inside this tomb before. However, only his brother had reached the sacred spring of life after having entered this tomb. Moreover, he had made the breakthrough into the great sage realm afterwards. Therefore, many people suspected that Tang Can possessed a map that could lead to the sacred spring of life. One would certainly have a huge advantage in their quest for the sacred spring of life if they obtained this map. The Evil Corpse mountain range was very dangerous. And this tomb might be even more dangerous. Nobody knew what kind of dangers they might come across inside. Therefore, everyone coveted the map that they thought Tang Can possessed. However, nobody had dared to attack him upon taking his sage accomplished level strength into account. Moreover, his brother was said to be waiting outside. But this didn't mean that nobody had planned to take advantage by deliberately make things chaotic. Things might be more complicated than what Yi Shiwen had imagined. However, this carefree-looking young Lord Tang Can obviously wasn't an idiot either. He also knew the severity of this matter. Therefore, he had already warned the sage experts that seemed ready to cause trouble. Yi Shiwen saw that these experts were just like wolves. It is true that a pack of wolves can kill a tiger. However, they need the leadership of a wolf king. And no one would be willing to act as the wolf king of this pack of wolves right now. After all, who would want to stand out among others and end up getting killed? And so, everyone seemed to be waiting for the appearance of another tiger. At this time, Yi Shiwen unintentionally glanced at Gong Yanjia. He was sitting cross-legged and was looking disdainfully at Tang Can. Soon, another tiger appeared. However, it wasn't a human. Instead, it was a sage accomplished level demon king. He was more than 2 meters tall and wore a golden armor. He looked just like an ape with his white head and red feet. The rest of his body was also red, like fire. His entire body exuded an oppressive coercion. This is the mythical Zhuyan ape. So, it turned out to be such a creature. Yi Ziwen's pupils contracted. This was an ominous ancient beast. It was mentioned in the legends that once this beast would appear, a big war would occur in the world. Obviously, Yi Shiwen wasn't the only one who had recognized this ominous beast. Many knowledgeable experts had also recognized it. There hadn't been many groups of Zhuyan ape in the ancient era, and they had become even rarer after the passage of thousands of years. This turned out to be the Zhuyan ape. My God, have I returned to the mythical age or something that I am seeing such a legendary beast? Someone uttered in disbelief. It seemed that they had become scared on seeing the Zhuyan ape. This is becoming even more chaotic. The Zhuyan ape possesses outstanding strength. He also possesses the bloodline of the ancient ominous beasts. He can easily blast away an ordinary expert of his realm. Everyone had been scared by the sudden appearance of this demon beast. After all, they hadn't expected that a demon king would come here. However, they then thought that if the humans could compete and fight, then why couldn't these demon beasts? Moreover, the Great Gas Collar was the territory of these demon beasts. So, the sudden appearance of this Zhuyan ape shouldn't be that surprising. An intense and vigilant look surfaced in Tang Can's eyes after the sudden appearance of this Zhuyan ape. This king has found out that someone had caught that a great thing like the sacred spring of life at this place. Gee, this king has been alive for several decades now. How has he never heard about it? The Zhuyan ape opened his mouth and said. The experts in the surrounding area became startled when he spoke in human tongue. He had cultivated up to the sage accomplished realm within a short span. In fact, such speed could give the humans an urge to kill themselves. The people that were present here were basically considered elites among the humans. But even they felt the same. Everyone knew that humans didn't have very long lifespans like the demon beasts. However, the cultivation speed of humans was much faster than that of demon beasts. In fact, it was several times faster. Only the peerless Heaven's Pride experts who were considered to be the extraordinary geniuses of their generation could cultivate up to the sage accomplished realm within the short span of several decades. However, this demon king's cultivation speed was equal to that of those Heaven's Pride experts. In fact, this was like cultivating up to the sage accomplished realm within a few years if seen in the perspective of human time. Even the term skyrocketed wasn't enough to describe such insane cultivation speed. Yi Shiwen was also surprised. This Zhuyan ape must be even more outstanding than that young genius Pang Yongbo whom Yi Shiwen had seen back in the day. However, Yi Shiwen also felt that this beast loved to show off. He clearly saw the proud expression flashing through the corner of Zhuyan ape's mouth. Apparently, this proud expression had surfaced after the ape had heard exclaims from the experts in the surroundings. Then, Yi Shiwen saw the Zhuyan ape grinning from ear to ear and looking all self-satisfied. And he realized that he hadn't misinterpreted. The Zhuyan ape indeed was a show-off. It wasn't that Yi Shiwen hadn't seen demon beasts with wisdom before. However, the fact that they possessed wisdom didn't mean that they had emotions as well. This was the reason why many demon beasts only knew slaughtering even though they had wisdom which was as good as that of humans. However, Yi Shiwen had seen such a smug demon beast for the first time in his life. The Zhuyan ape soon let out a loud laugh. Yi Shiwen suddenly had a bad feeling. Isn't the legendary Zhuyan ape supposed to be exceptionally brutal? There is no need to worship this king so much. This king exists merely in legends. The Zhuyan ape suddenly made a frightening statement. This statement gave a thundershock to the surrounding experts who were already in a state of shock because of the sudden appearance of the Zhuyan ape. Humans always paid attention to modesty. Praising oneself was rare for humans. On the other hand, this ape was doing just that in front of so many people. He was blatantly showing off in front of such a big crowd. However, Yi Shiwen had a slightly favorable impression of this Zhuyan ape who loved to show off. After all, it was more likely for people to have a good impression of a demon beast who loved to show off as compared to an ice-cold one. The Zhuyan ape's complexion immediately changed when he saw Tang Can giving him a bad look from the other side. "What are you looking at? Haven't you seen a handsome Zhuyan ape before?" The Zhuyan ape said. Suddenly, a baffled look appeared across everyone's face. This Zhuyan ape was too valiant. However, his voice hadn't even faded when another figure appeared. It was a very big silver eagle. In fact, it was bigger than the Zhuyan ape. It was at least more than 3 meters tall. Its entire body was silver. In fact, it seemed that its big feathered wings had been dyed in silver. They were emitting rays of serene light. The eagle looked very scary. It spurred a storm of astral wind as soon as it arrived. This silver eagle king possessed the demeanor of a true demon king, unlike the Zhuyan ape. Everyone reckoned that this was the third sage accomplished level expert to arrive at this place. Many sage accomplished level experts had arrived in Great Gas Collar this time. However, many of those sage accomplished level experts were outsiders. So, it was possible that they hadn't heard the various important rumors that were spread widely across the River Shore Star Field. Consequently, it was normal if they didn't know about this tomb. The Silver Eagle King swept its ice-cold vision across everyone. But it didn't say anything. It just stood alone with a proud expression on its face. It was waiting for the tomb to open. Sorry for coming late," a lazy voice came from afar. It turned out to be a handsome man who looked to be around 20 years old. He was dressed in a spacious white robe. He came out walking leisurely from the forest. He was shouting in embarrassment. Everyone squinted. It was another sage accomplished level expert. Fortunately, it had turned out to be a human expert this time. A lot of human experts felt relaxed because of this. 2 among the 3 sage accomplished level experts that had arrived here before were demon beasts. This had made them worried. Killings also used to occur between humans. However, it couldn't be compared with the killings between humans and demon beasts. Things at least looked balanced now after another human expert of sage-accomplished realm had arrived. The situation didn't look risky and unbalanced like it had a moment ago. Everyone's gaze was fixed upon Tang Can. They were waiting for his clan's masters of matrix formations to break those enchantments and barrier formations. Tang Can became somewhat depressed because of these people's stares. "Why are you staring at me?" After that, he became somewhat angry. In fact, he was about to burst vigorously. Suddenly, a loud explosion occurred, and countless matrix formations broke down. They transformed into a dreadful energy storm and swept towards outside. Those masters of matrix formations whom Tang Can had brought got blasted to death on the spot. Their internal organs had been ruptured, and blood gushed out from all the pores of their bodies. However, a huge hole had been opened in the tomb by this dreadful explosion, and endless billows of the negative energies rolled out of the tomb. But Tang Can didn't care about the death of his men. Instead, he immediately flew towards that hole. Those experts that had arrived with him immediately reacted and surrounded the entrance of the tomb. They were planning to prevent the other people from going inside or delaying them so that they could buy some time for Tang Can to go in. "You're courting death. How dare you block the path of this king?" That show-off giant ape suddenly became angry, and a pair of iron fists slammed down from the sky. It seemed as if two flaming meteors had fallen from the sky. Rumble! The terrifying fists shook the space and opened cracks in it. The scene appeared very terrifying as the cracks proliferated in all directions. A few nearby experts among the experts that had blocked the entrance got blasted to death, and a huge gap opened in their formation as a result. The Zhuyan ape transformed into a group of flames and burst into that gap. The Silver Eagle King also moved from the other side. It transformed into a silver light and flew past those experts that were standing in front of him. Those experts screamed as they got chopped into a gory mess. Chapter 560. "Oh, this is such a hassle," the white-clothed young man shouted as he strode forward. It seemed as if a vast chunk of distance had shrunk to an inch before him as he bypassed all those experts that were guarding the tomb entrance and disappeared into the tomb in an instant. "Kill them, rush in." It wasn't known who had shouted first. However, the experts who had been getting restless shouted one after another and rushed inside. Those experts that had blocked the way didn't dare to stop them and stepped aside one after another. They were many in number. However, the opposite side had even more people. Moreover, the people who were blocking everyone's path had only intended to delay these experts. They didn't want to die here. Yi Shiwen followed Gong Yanjia and other people and rushed in. And they entered in nearly an instant. Yi Ziwen's team were the top players among the crowd. So Yi Ziwen's team soon pushed to the front and took the lead as they rushed in. Whoosh! Yi Shiwen had merely entered the tomb. He hadn't even observed the surrounding environment when he heard the shrill sound of breaking of space which came from behind him. Then a huge yin and yang fish suddenly swept down towards him. It opened its big mouth like a sacrificial bowl in order to bite at him. "You have a death wish." How could Yi Shiwen have not known that it was old Yin who had attacked? However, he wasn't surprised. In fact, he had been vigilant towards old Yin and Gong Yanjia since the beginning. He hadn't relaxed for even a moment. Old Yin had attacked very suddenly. However, Yi Shiwen was prepared for this attack. Yi Shiwen made a roundabout turn and brandished his palms. Bang! A pair of flesh palms and the huge yin and yang fish collided with each other in the air. And a dreadful explosion arose from the clash of these two tremendous powers. This explosion destroyed even the atoms of the air. The sound of the explosion unceasingly reverberated in the surroundings. However, the space inside the tomb was kept intact by a kind of vigorous energy. Even the fight between two top-tier experts of Sage Realm couldn't break this space. The turbulence caused by this huge explosion hadn't scattered when old Yin attacked again. His face carried an incomparably sinister smile as he rushed forth. "Yi Shiwen, you're done for. You've entered this tomb now." and this rich place is my domain. I will smash you to death like an ant." The black-robed old carried a wild smile on his face. His scheme was profound as well as unfathomably sophisticated. The plan looked fierce. However, it was only for those people whom he considered ants. However, he also knew the weight of the matter when dealing with a powerful person like Yi Shiwen. Therefore, he didn't lose his cool and resort to attacking nonstop. Instead, he acted with patience. He had practiced the power of polarity in order to enter this tomb. So, one could say that this place was his home ground. He could display his strength to several times its normal extent at this place. He had become extremely powerful in this place. He could escape even from the hands of a sage accomplished level expert at this place. And he could easily blast away an ordinary expert of sage great perfection realm. The energy at this place was unprecedented. The negative energy wasn't good for other people and they would evade it. However, it was great nourishment for him. In fact, he even felt that his cultivation would advance by leaps and bounds if he could practice at this place for a few years. And making a breakthrough into the sage accomplished realm would just be a matter of time for him if that was the case. He liked it here. It was his home ground. Whoever would come in here had to follow his house rules. The imposing aura of old had gotten promoted by a huge margin under the supply of power at this place. Yi Shiwen had realized that old strength had increased by a great margin ever since they had reached this evil corpse mountain range. In fact, it seemed that he had come back to his home after he had entered the evil corpse mountain range. He had been forced to put some effort in killing those demon beasts outside. However, he had been killing zombies effortlessly after he had entered the evil corpse mountain range. Moreover, a very big change had occurred when he had entered inside the tomb. He had absorbed a huge amount of these energies, and this had made his strength reach the highest peak of the sage great perfection realm. Therefore, he had decided to attack without any hesitation. Earlier, he had weighed himself and had found out that he wasn't a match for Yi Shiwen. However, he had become very confident now since he could draw support from the evil energies of this tomb. It's not good. Damn it. This old fogey has attacked. Xiao Yuan was the first one to react. She didn't have a good relation with Yi Shiwen in the beginning. However, she had later realized that she didn't have an everlasting kind of enmity with him either. But she could get everlasting benefits from him if she mended things. And she would obviously have no issue with Yi Shiwen as long as he could provide her enough benefits. Yi Shiwen hadn't helped her in a direct manner. However, it couldn't be denied that Yi Ziwen's assistance had made their journey towards the sacred spring of life much smoother. They didn't have to be worried about their lives since they had the escort of a powerful expert like Yi Shiwen. In fact, Yi Ziwen's assistance would be extremely valuable even if they eventually failed to find the sacred spring of life. The people of this team didn't get along on the surface or in heart. After all, everyone harbored ulterior motives. However, they weren't at each other's throat either. But things wouldn't remain the same once that had happened. Moreover, Xiao Yuan had realized that Yi Shiwen didn't kill indiscriminately even though he was a very decisive killer. He didn't move into action as long as someone didn't provoke him. And such a person was far better than a hothead like Gong Yanjia. So, she would certainly choose Yi Shiwen if she had to choose among the two. However, old had become extremely hostile after he had borrowed the evil power from this tomb. And this had dramatically changed the situation all of a sudden. This old fogey has become so powerful after drawing support from the power. Ding Tong was somewhat worried. She was most concerned about Yi Ziwen's survival among all these people. After all, she could depend only upon an extremely powerful person like Yi Shiwen in a place like this tomb which had become increasingly chaotic with time. One could die on the spot in a place like this if they weren't careful. She couldn't find out what Gu Tian, Yu Rei, and Imogen were thinking when she glanced at them. Moreover, they didn't seem to be surprised by old Yin's sudden attack. In fact, it seemed as if they had been feeling the gradual rise in old Yin's killing intention for Yi Shiwen for a while. The crucial person in all this Gong Yanjia was standing on the side. He was staring at Yi Shiwen with his ice-cold vision. It didn't seem that he was planning to attack. However, his focus seemed to be firmly locked upon Yi Shiwen. And it seemed that he could get involved in this fight at any time. Yi Shiwen, today I will take your head to pay homage to my brother. Old Een stepped forward as the chilling Een wind blew against his clothes. Then a seemingly invincible, imposing aura swept out. It seemed as if he was the only ruler in this dark tomb, a lord of death who had come from hell. He attacked in an instant, and an almost entirely black yin and yang diagram suddenly got formed in the air. It seemed that it would break the entire world as it swept down towards Yi Shiwen in a dreadful stance in order to crush him. Yi Shiwen felt a terrifying suppressive force that seemed to be firmly locked upon him. He secretly pondered at this moment. I hadn't expected that old Een would become so powerful after entering the tomb. He wasn't a match for me in the beginning. In fact, he couldn't withstand even a single blow of mine. However, now he has become so powerful that his imposing aura could be compared with the dreadful imposing aura exerted by Gong Yanjia when he goes all out. However, he wasn't planning to retreat. In fact, his face exposed a somewhat excited look. After all, old Een had attacked with his entire strength. And he seemed almost as powerful as Gong Yanjia now. So, Yi Shiwen could get some idea about Gong Yanjia's strength by fighting with him. Consequently, he wouldn't be caught off guard when Gong Yanjia would attack. The golden divinities in Yi Ziwen's entire body began to boil. Then, waves of divine pressure swept out in the surroundings. And the evil Een energies present in the surroundings instantly got suppressed as a result. These divinities were the purest positive yang power of the world. Naturally, the divinities and these evil Een energies were opposing forces. Therefore, a stunning collision occurred in a flash, and layers upon layers of terrifying shock waves swept out everywhere. The divinities that were boiling inside Yi Ziwen's body seemed to be dyed in golden. It seemed that a golden god of war had arrived from the ancient times. There were no fancy moves used, only a fist swept out. This fist attack was simple. However, it contained all the essence of Yi Ziwen's fist technique and his comprehension of fist intention. And all of that had been condensed in this fist. Crackle crackle. Yi Ziwen's fist intention and the yin and yang diagram collided in midair. It seemed that the two dreadful auras would swallow each other as they collided in the space. Bang! An extremely scary explosion sounded from the point of collision of the two forces. And the space began to shake and twist because of it. The space fluctuated like sea waves. Layers upon layers of shock waves swept out and went very far. The other teams and the scattered experts saw this scene. However, they didn't stop to see this fight. They didn't know why these two men were fighting. Moreover, finding the sacred spring of life was much more important for them at this time. And they were already far behind Tang Can, who was ahead of everyone. In fact, they had basically lost him. So, one could assume that they would practically lose the sacred spring of life if they didn't hurry and catch up with him. Everyone was sure that Tang Can possessed the map that could lead to the sacred spring of life. So, they wouldn't lose their way as long as they followed him. They would definitely find that legendary sacred spring of life if they followed him. The sage experts of the entire universe would certainly go crazy and arrive here if the news about this holy water that could increase the odds of entering the great sage realm proliferated. They had a great opportunity right before their eyes. So, how could they miss it? Therefore, nobody stayed at this place. Everyone flew away from the sight of this team's internal strife. Step! Step! Old Een unceasingly retreated several steps, and then stopped. Finally, he got rid of the backward push that had been exerted by Yi Ziwen's attack. He had realized what kind of pressure his brother must have faced earlier. This slim guy didn't appear to be extremely powerful. However, he had fought with this guy for some time now. So, he had understood that this boy's strength was so immense that it could scare a person to death. In fact, an ordinary person would immediately go out flying if they bumped into him. He was able to resist Yi Shiwen because he was fortunately in a Een-rich place like this tomb. It was his home ground. So, he wasn't running out of energy as his energy was getting supplemented at this place. He wanted to stay at this place even more now because he had finally realized how ferocious Yi Shiwen was. After all, Yi Shiwen would be an enormous threat to him if he went outside. Boy, nobody can save you today. Chapter 561. Boy, nobody can save you today. I will tear you to shreds. You'll die miserably. I will make you wail in pain until you die. Black-robed old Een roared as his expression turned even more sinister. It seemed that he would vent all the pent-up frustration in his heart. He immediately attacked. A share of evil Een energy condensed into a mountain and smashed down. It looked enormous as it pressed down vigorously. He clearly knew of Yi Ziwen's ferocity. Therefore, he couldn't afford to let Yi Shiwen escape in this situation wherein he had the advantage. Otherwise, he would have to deal with enormous trouble in the future. He couldn't let this tiger return to the mountains. However, he hadn't anticipated the fact that Yi Shiwen wasn't planning on escaping. The evil Een power could be considered as extremely troublesome for ordinary people. In fact, an ordinary person could die on being exposed to too much evil Een power. However, Yi Shiwen was no ordinary person. He could convert this evil Een power into spirit energy by drawing support from the heavenly source mirror. The source of his power had always been spirit energy no matter what kind of power he absorbed. Only various attributive changes would get added during the conversion. The heavenly source mirror used to thoroughly discard the various attributes which were detrimental to him. It only let the purest spirit energies enter inside Yi Ziwen's body. Yi Shiwen wasn't in a homely kind of environment unlike black-robed old Een. This environment wouldn't suddenly increase his strength. However, it didn't mean that he would be suppressed by it like most people had imagined. Therefore, black-robed old Een was gravely mistaken if he was thinking that he could force Yi Shiwen to flee. You don't know how bad it will be for you if you're thinking about killing me. You're acting recklessly. Yi Shiwen sneered. He then strode forward, and his hands suddenly issued layers of golden light. Then his divinities concentrated on his hands. And the might of his hands greatly increased in an instant. This scene looked extremely terrifying. The evil Een energy mountain was still smashing down towards Yi Ziwen's body. However, Yi Shiwen stepped out and attacked the mountain before it could reach him. Dreadful divinities had condensed on his hands. His hands ripped apart that mountain and transformed it into evil Een energy. This energy was then absorbed by him in an instant. However, his golden face turned pale because of absorbing too much evil Een power in one breath. The evil Een power froze his internal organs, meridians, and bones immediately after it had entered his body. The negative polarity of this power made it extremely cold and scary. However, this happened only for an instant since he had quickly operated the heavenly source mirror. The heavenly source mirror had then transformed the evil Een power into spirit energies and scattered them into his body. The Phoenix regeneration technique once again demonstrated its extreme healing power. All of his injuries healed almost in an instant. Yi Shiwen was happy that the evil Een power was present in abundance at this place. It seemed that the evil Een power had accumulated at this place for 1,000 or maybe even 10,000 years. The tomb had never stayed open for a long time. So, the evil Een power hadn't drained out. It was entirely concentrated at this place. The amount of evil Een power present at this place was countless times more than that present at the so-called sacred cultivation spots in the outside world. In fact, it was a death trap for ordinary people. They had to unceasingly use the protection of their real elemental energy in order to resist the invasion of this evil Een power. However, this place was like a paradise for a person like Yi Shiwen who could convert the evil Een power into spirit energy. In fact, he experienced the feeling of being reborn every time he took a breath. This negative Een energy had caused an enormous impact on his internal organs immediately after it had entered his body. This was difficult for him to completely control it even if he had practiced the tyrant body technique. He had already cultivated his physique to a great extent when it came to the tempering of muscles, bones, and flesh. So, he could now withstand the continuous bombardment of sage tools whilst being unarmed. Therefore, he was focusing on the cultivation of the interior of his body at this time. He had no choice but to operate the tyrant body technique in order to fight the negative yin energy that he had inhaled. Otherwise, his entire body would have frozen to death. Moreover, this would prove to be a huge advantage as far as practicing the tyrant body technique was concerned. This place was like hell for other people, but it was like a sacred cultivation spot for Yi Shiwen. However, his case was completely different from that of the black-robed old Yin. This place had become a sacred cultivation spot for black-robed old Yin because it was compatible with his attributes. It seemed as if Yi Shiwen had seized all the luck in the world. He had forcibly transformed an unfavorable situation into a favorable one merely to temper himself. Other people couldn't even think of doing something like that. In fact, they didn't even have the perseverance to do so. Yi Shiwen had recovered almost in an instant. The sound of Phoenix was faintly emitting from his body because of the operation of the Phoenix regeneration technique. He didn't stop it for even a bit. He then stepped out. His golden figure flickered and immediately arrived in front of black-robed old Yin. Bang! Yi Shiwen brandished his fist. He had attacked with his entire strength without any hesitation. After all, they had already landed into a mortal combat. His fist transformed into a big star and slammed down from above. The boundless Yin energy in the surroundings transformed into a hellish scene of shrieking and wailing ghosts. It seemed as if the enraged evil Yin energy was mimicking the scene of a ruined city which had perished under tragic circumstances. Black-robed old Yin spouted a mouthful of blood. All defense-type divine tools on his body had been destroyed by Yi Shiwen in a moment's time. However, the defenses of these very tools had also bought him a moment's time. The black-robed old Yin flew a large distance backwards by taking advantage of this moment. However, his face exposed a look of disbelief. How can you be so powerful? Black-robed old Yin still couldn't believe his eyes. He had calculated in his mind that he would catch Yi Shiwen off guard and wouldn't give him a chance to fight back. He would kill him in one move under such favorable circumstance. However, his plan didn't work. He couldn't have the slightest impact on Yi Shiwen even under such favorable circumstances since Yi Shiwen's strength was simply incredible. Black-robed old Yin had already become enough powerful. In fact, he could already feel that he was getting closer to the threshold of the sage-accomplished realm in such a Yin-rich place. It was like a natural moat that was present right before him in the past. However, it now seemed that he could step over this barrier at any time. He could tell that he had already acquired the topmost strength of Sage Great Perfection Realm. However, he had been instantly routed by an expert of late stage of Sage Realm like Yi Shiwen. It was ridiculous to the extent that even the end of the world would seem more reasonable or probable in comparison. However, he could only watch helplessly as this matter unfolded before his eyes. Is he really human? This thought appeared in the mind of black-robed old Yin. However, he didn't have the time to think about this because Yi Shiwen didn't give him any time and rushed over once again. His speed was so fast that he broke down the sound barrier. And this issued an ear-piercing sound of space being torn. Bang! Yi Shiwen's fist pounded upon the body of black-robed old Yin, and he immediately went out flying by the attack. His body almost broke down and blood splashed out. However, a long leg suddenly fell down from above when Yi Shiwen was thinking of obtaining the advantage of the situation to attack again. It looked like the big leg of a god that had arrived to end the world. It issued boundless energy storms wherever it went. Everyone was left dumbstruck. Gong Yanjia had been casually watching this fight a moment ago from the sidelines. But he had attacked at this time. He couldn't idly watch black-robed old Yin being killed. This was against his tyrannical disposition. And he had attacked with his entire strength. His leg technique simply went against the heaven's will. Initially, his leg was a flawed part of his body. However, now it had become the most formidable one. The big leg suddenly trampled in front of Yi Shiwen. An ice-cold predatory pressure firmly pressed upon Yi Shiwen's body. Who would have imagined that Yi Shiwen would stay calm and composed right now? He wasn't taken aback by Gong Yanjia's sudden attack. In fact, he had already anticipated it. Gong Yanjia wouldn't have attacked if black-robed old Yin had killed Yi Shiwen in an instant. However, he obviously wouldn't hesitate to attack if the situation changed. What fairness? Did such a thing even exist? It's over. The scale of this fight has expanded again. Damn it. Xiao Yuan unexpectedly regretted this time. There was no margin for relaxation for either side after Gong Yanjia had gotten involved in the fight. Only death could be the end for one of the sides in this fight. The strength of their small team would certainly decline enormously under such a situation. And she didn't wish to see this. Moreover, they were all thinking about whose side they should stand on. It wasn't clear when Yi Shiwen and Gong Yanjia had become two pillars of this small team. They were also the two backbones of this team. However, now a fight had broken out between these two backbones. Everyone was thinking about whom they should help. Even Yu Rui was no exception to this. Yu Rui had a tacit understanding with Gong Yanjia. However, he had also seen Yi Zaiwen's terrifying strength. So, it would be foolish for him to jump into trouble for Gong Yanjia this time. This was a small team which was comprised of people who had harbored ulterior motives since the beginning. But it was on the verge of collapse at this time. Some people were optimistic about Yi Zaiwen's chances, while some were optimistic about Gong Yanjia's. Everyone had witnesses Yi Zaiwen's strength. However, they couldn't ignore Gong Yanjia's strength. Gong Yanjia alone was very difficult to deal with. However, he had now collaborated with black-robed old Yin, whose strength had increased abruptly here. Everyone felt that Yi Shiwen might have better odds of winning if it were to be one-on-one. However, he had very less odds of winning when it came to two-on-one. It seems that your leg wasn't lame after all. Let me break it and make you a cripple for real. Yi Shiwen shouted. He then turned around and shot his fist towards the big leg that was stamping down. Bang! A terrible collision occurred which issued metal clanging sounds. Then, incredible shock waves swept out and twisted the entire space. This leg had been converted into a sage tool. It had seemed extremely terrifying as it had smashed down with its entire strength. This attack was equivalent to the full-strength attack of a sage tool. However, Yi Shiwen could even block a sage tool barehanded. His body was undoubtedly very tough. The leg kept on pressing downwards upon him. However, his body didn't budge. It stood motionless just like a green pine tree while facing this dreadful attack. His legs were firmly rooted to the ground. This was a reflection of his martial arts foundation. And it was evident that his foundation had reached an extremely profound state. The terrified look grew intense in the eyes of Gong Yanjia. He was wary of Yi Shiwen since he had clashed with him for the first time. However, he hadn't expected that he wouldn't get even the slightest advantage. In fact, even his sage tool crippled leg felt like it would fall apart under the impact of this clash. The killing intention in his eyes became even more intense as he thought this. It then surged out everywhere. Chapter 562. Gong Yanjia's terrifying aura surged everywhere. It then firmly locked upon Yi Shiwen. Gong Yanjia looked outstanding and peerless at this moment, just like a devil god. He strode forward in a flash. And endless divine beams whistled and swept out. Those divine beams then transformed into a fierce attack and bombarded towards Yi Shiwen to kill him. This was the most dreadful long-ranged attack. Meanwhile, black-robed old Yin had quickly recovered by relying upon this Yin-rich place. However, his complexion had turned even paler. He wasn't feeling well because he had inhaled a large amount of evil Yin energy in an instant. However, he had no other option but to do so in order to deal with Yi Shiwen. His attack transformed into a huge Yin and Yang fish, and suddenly swept towards Yi Shiwen. Two dreadful attacks were simultaneously sweeping towards Yi Shiwen to kill him. Everyone felt that Yi Shiwen couldn't resist these two dreadful attacks at the same time. In fact, it would have been impressive if he could resist even one, let alone two. Energy waves surged all around. And the evil Yin energy in the surroundings suddenly began to boil. It seemed as if the world had been rocked by a major disaster. Yi Shiwen didn't hold back even a bit. His both hands emitted seemingly inexhaustible golden lights. It seemed as if these golden beams would tear apart the entire world. Yi Zaiwen's hands tore apart those two dreadful attacks as soon as they arrived in front of him. His eyes looked incomparably deep at the moment. It seemed as if the cycle of rebirth and destruction of the universe was taking place inside them. His killing intention was unhindered. He had become even more determined to kill these two men. These two men had long been planning to kill him. And he had also planned to kill them before they got ready. Bang! 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 The three men suddenly engaged in a battle in the air above the tomb. The two parties didn't give each other any chance to gain the upper hand. They were exhausting all of their power in order to kill the opposite party. He is fighting two great experts at the same time. Gu Tian's eyes revealed an astonished expression. He had been blown away by Gong Yanjia in one kick earlier. And there were certainly many reasons behind that. However, he had no choice but to admit that Gong Yanjia was more powerful than him. However, Gong Yanjia and black-robed old Yin hadn't been able to bring down Yi Shiwen even after they had joined hands. Moreover, he hasn't fallen into any disadvantageous positions till now. Yi Shiwen is just too ferocious. Xiao Yuan also hadn't anticipated that things would turn out like this. She had initially guessed that the best Yi Shiwen could do on having to face the combined attack of these two men was retreat. However, Yi Shiwen was in a far better situation at the moment than what she had imagined. Yi Ziwen's fists appeared like big stars. It seemed as if a star had ignited and started to boil every time he brandished his fist. A universe-like scene had appeared all around him. The fight had reached a superheated stage. And neither side was holding back at this time. Each of Yi Ziwen's fist was transforming into a big star, and was then smashing down. These stars were the embodiment of the ideal condition of the most callous fist intention out there which Yi Shiwen had comprehended. One could only imagine their suppression force. Gong Yanjia and black-robed old Yin had gone all out as well. But they had been becoming increasingly terrified in their heart as they had continued their attack on Yi Shiwen. It was a kind of mood that was very hard to describe for them. After all, they had been forced into a disadvantageous position by Yi Shiwen even after they had collaborated. Such a thing had never happened to them. Has Yi Shiwen already reached the sage-accomplished realm? They had already reached their peak state as per their capabilities of sage great perfection realm. Bang! Yi Shiwen shot another fist. This fist drew out a universe. It then evolved into a big star and swept out. This was the most dreadful fist attack. Yi Ziwen's fist's attacks were becoming increasingly smoother with the progression of this fight. Moreover, he also began to feel a slight need to make a breakthrough. This discovery had made him excited. This tomb was simply a heaven for him since he could transform the negative Yin energy in this tomb into his own. Consequently, this was the best sacred place for his cultivation. The result of cultivating at this place could be 10 times better than that of cultivating outside. Moreover, he wasn't even a bit worried about his foundation being unstable at this place. In fact, he hadn't come across a time when he had felt that his foundation was unstable. On the contrary, he had felt it to be a bit too stable the majority of time. And that was why it had become very difficult for him to make the breakthrough into every major realm. Bang! The dreadful fist pressure routed the defenses of both men. In fact, their defenses looked laughable as they faced such a terrifying attack. Poof! Black-robed old Yin had the weakest martial power among them. He couldn't resist such a violent collision and spouted a mouthful of blood. His body went out flying, and all of his bones got broken. He had once again been blown away by Yi Shiwen, and that too as strongly as the first time. Even he and Gong Yanjia together couldn't pose any threat to Yi Shiwen. However, Yi Shiwen didn't delay. He immediately rushed towards black-robed old Yin. Don't you dare think of that! Gong Yanjia roared in his hoarse voice. He knew that he would be Yi Ziwen's next target once Yi Shiwen had killed black-robed old Yin. And he might not be able to escape in that situation. Therefore, he must not let Yi Shiwen kill black-robed old Yin. His big and terrifying leg kicked out an endless stream of divine beams in the surrounding space. It seemed that these divine beams would crush the space. They even contained faint traces of Tao principles. Yi Shiwen shot sword energy through the back of his hand. The sword energy swept across, and suppressed everything in the surroundings. It then went towards that big leg. Bang! This was a terrifying collision, and a terrible storm swept out from it. Ding Tong and the other people who were present in the surrounding couldn't withstand it. So, they moved aside in order to avoid being injured by this terrifying astral wind. Gong Yanjia had been blown away by the tremendous impact of this collision. He trod several steps in the space and then finally stopped. Every step that he took caused ripples in the space, as if it were a water surface. Yi Shiwen seized this opportunity to rush towards black-robed Old Een. A big hand stretched out to grasp black-robed Old Een. It transformed into a big golden hand and grabbed black-robed Old Een. Bang! Yi Shiwen crushed black-robed Old Een in his palm and transformed him into a mass of blood fog. Black-robed Old Een had died screaming, and his flesh and soul had been absorbed by the heavenly source mirror. Yi Shiwen turned around to look for Gong Yanjia. However, Gong Yanjia had abandoned black-robed Old Een. He had transformed into a streamer of light and had disappeared into the depths of the tomb. Gong Yanjia had realized that he couldn't stop Yi Shiwen. So, he knew that black-robed Old En's death was certain. He also knew that he wouldn't have been able to escape from Yi Ziwen's hands if he had delayed even a bit. Yi Shiwen, you wait for me. I won't let you off. Gong Yanjia's hoarse and sharp roar came from the passage inside tomb. It seemed from his voice that he hadn't entirely given up. He hadn't expected that he would be defeated in this fight. However, he had lost at the hands of this boy whom he had underestimated since the beginning. Yi Shiwen thought for a moment, but he eventually decided against pursuing him. His faint feeling of making the breakthrough had become increasingly intense by now. Moreover, his fighting strength would leap to the Sage Accomplished realm if he made the breakthrough into Sage Peak realm. And Gong Yanjia would be as insignificant as fleeting clouds in front of his absolute strength at that time. So, it wouldn't matter what kind of tricks he would come up with. Yi Shiwen had dropped the idea of pursuing him after this thought had come across his mind. Anyway, he would meet him inside this tomb sooner or later, and he would settle his matter at that time. What are you going to do now? Yi Shiwen looked at everyone and asked. His words contained a faint oppression, especially for Yu Rui. After all, Yi Shiwen knew that Yu Rui had a tacit understanding with Gong Yanjia. Moreover, Yu Rui also had an understanding with Emo Zhen, whom he himself had brought. Well, obviously follow your commands. Yu Rui had no choice but to bow under such formidable and oppressive power. He was certainly arrogant. However, he wasn't someone who wouldn't recognize the current situation. Black-robed Old Een had died, and Gong Yanjia had escaped in desperation. So, only Yi Shiwen was left. Yi Shiwen felt pleased with his reply. He wasn't worried that Yu Rui would play tricks behind his back. So he said, very well. However, I don't want to stay in this team after this fight. So you're on your own. Yi Ziwen's words shook these few experts. Everyone apart from Ding Tong exposed a pleasantly surprised expression. After all, they were also outstanding talents of their generation, who would want to obey the commands of an overlord, who would like to be treated as petty and low-profile servants. Nobody wanted that. Gong Yanjia had left, and Yi Shiwen also wanted to leave. This was a very good thing. The strength of their small team would undoubtedly decline enormously after the departure of these two powerful men. However, they could act more freely now. Yi Shiwen knew what they were thinking. He knew that they were eagerly waiting for him to leave. However, he must now look for a place to undergo closed-door training. He was also suspicious about these teammates who didn't get along well with each other. It would be hilarious if they came to him at their most critical time. Yi Shiwen flew towards the depths of the tomb after leaving the team. He killed many zombies which were scattered in the passage on his way. Soon, he found a secluded hall in a remote corner. He laid out layer upon layer of barriers at this place. In addition, Yi Mo was personally keeping watch. So, Yi Shiwen set his mind at rest and began the closed-door practice. After that, Yi Shiwen started to operate the real elemental energy and the observing person scripture inside his body. Endless negative Een energies got converted into spirit energies within a few breaths. They then got absorbed by him. His aura also began to grow crazily. Endless number of negative evil energies transformed into spirit energies to satisfy Yi Zaiwen's urge. And this helped him to promote his power unhindered. It seemed as if Yi Zaiwen's entire body had transformed into a universe, and he was the only god sitting at the center of it. He was the one who had evolved this universe. His golden divinities crawled over his entire body, and his entire body turned golden. He looked solemn and serene. He looked like the image of a golden god from afar. Time passed day by day, and 3 months' time passed in an instant. The pores all over Yi Zaiwen's body were opening and closing unceasingly inside the secluded hall. He was breathing with his pores, and was unceasingly absorbing the negative yin energies. He was transforming negative yin energies into spirit energies, and was then moving them to his dantian. He had repeated this process again and again for the last 3 months, without stopping for even a moment. It wasn't known how many times he had tried to break the threshold, but he had finally reached the limit at this time. Consequently, he broke past it in one fell swoop. Bang! The negative yin energies started to enter Yi Zaiwen's body at a much faster speed. They were being immediately absorbed by him. His strong and majestic aura suddenly rushed up. It wasn't known how much stronger it had become than before. Yi Shiwen opened his eyes and let out a smile from the corner of his mouth. He had finally entered the Sage Peak realm. Chapter 563. Things hadn't quietened down in these 3 months. The situation had become even more intense. On the contrary. Many other people had obtained news about this tomb and had arrived here. The news about Sacred Spring of Life had also gradually spread out. And the arrival of a large number of experts had made the entire situation even more chaotic. An increasing number of people had rushed over here in the last 3 months. However, many people had died as well. In addition, the zombies had begun to appear more frequently at this place. The zombies had smelled the auras of the large number of powerful human experts and demon beasts that had arrived here, and this had awakened them from their long slumber. The losses had also increased with time. However, the experts hadn't given up and left the place as they hadn't yet obtained the most important thing, the Sacred Spring of Life. They were still looking for that thing that had made them go crazy. Tang Ken was most likely to find the Sacred Spring of Life, but he hadn't obtained the news yet. This was because he had to focus on evading the many experts that were tracking him. This place used to open very occasionally, but it had attracted many experts still. Yi Shiwen had been laying low for the past 3 months. However, it was time for him to move into action. He had planned to find Tang Ken in order to obtain the map of this tomb from him, just like many other people. Yi Shiwen retracted the barrier formations that he had laid out. His principles looked intertwined and deeply rooted. They were firmly entrenched inside his body just like the roots of an old tree. Every principle was exceptionally thick and tough. Every strand showed his understanding of the associated principles. He possessed 9,999 Tao principles at the moment. It seemed now that his one fist could crush star. He had absorbed an endless amount of negative yin energy in these 3 months closed-door training. His foundation had strengthened as a result. Moreover, his body had enormously tempered as well. His body had made a huge progress because of this training. This was a pleasant surprise. The toughness of his body had promoted enormously after he had practiced the tyrant body to the 7th layer. And now it had again become even more difficult for him to advance a step further. He hadn't expected that the negative yin energy would help him in practicing the tyrant body technique. He had always understood that cultivating tyrant body technique was bound to be difficult for him. This represented the so-called saying, when the heavens confer the duty of capitalizing on an opportunity upon a person, they must first suffer from their own aspirations. He could have considered this place as his other home if the zombies weren't running amok and unknown things weren't buried here. The zombies had touched the edges of this secluded hall several times in these 3 months. Fortunately, Yi Shiwen had laid out the matrix formations. Therefore, he could isolate his aura and prevent those zombies from sensing it. Making a breakthrough to the 8th layer of Tyrant Body technique would no longer be a dream if I were to practice here for a few years, Yi Shiwen said. However, he didn't think about it further. It was out of the question for him to practice at this place even though his mental state had become very strong. After all, this place was densely packed with zombies. Yi Shiwen, your body has become so powerful now. But you are still dissatisfied? Diemo said. You will have to wait until you have touched the edge of the Great Sage Realm if you want to make the breakthrough into the 8th layer of Tyrant Body technique. It will be possible only then. Yi Shiwen was startled by this. However, Yi Mo's words were reasonable nonetheless. He needed a huge amount of spirit energies if he wanted to temper his body and advance at the same time. However, it was impossible for him to absorb so much spirit energies at present. It would become possible only after he had touched the edge of the Great Sage Realm. However, there was hardly any person in the Sage Realm that could make him frown. And that's because he had entered the 7th layer Tyrant Body technique now. However, the most important thing right now is to plunder the treasures that are buried and concealed inside this tomb. After all, these treasures are equivalent to boundless wealth. And they are very important for your cultivation. Yi Mo continued. Yes. Yi Shiwen nodded. He had also thought so. His cultivation couldn't remain limited to his current level. He had to promote himself to the legends in the future. He had to make the breakthrough into the Great Sage Realm. His cultivation's journey was endless. So, he was more dependent upon these external resources than other people. It would have certainly been much more difficult for him to make a breakthrough if he didn't have the assistance of these external resources. In fact, he wouldn't have been able to make such an aggressive progress if he hadn't been getting lucky with regards to these external resources. Therefore, he had never avoided collecting external objects. The so-called saying wealth is merely a worldly possession didn't apply to Yi Shiwen, whose cultivation depended on this wealth. This was more so in a place like this. Yi Ziwen's martial power would progress quickly as long as he had enough spirit stones. Likewise, his inner realm would also progress quickly. Both of these progresses were directly proportional and complementary. It wasn't like other people's progresses where they would have to stop to consolidate their newly attained inner realm after having promoted to a particular stage. This was his biggest advantage. And he obviously wanted to make full use of it. Yi Shiwen entered the tunnel of the tomb immediately after he came out of the secluded hall where he had been sitting. It was pitch black in the tunnel, and the negative Yin energy was present everywhere. However, he could see everything clearly as if it was daytime. This darkness was nothing for him. Yi Shiwen had barely come out when he found the zombies wandering outside. All of them were at Sage Realm. They looked extremely fierce and tough. This tomb might have been the abode of a great person when they were alive. It had many halls, and a large number of magical items and heavenly treasures were present in those halls. Yi Shiwen searched all the halls one by one. He plundered everything. There had been many zombies guarding these halls. However, it hadn't been a problem for Yi Shiwen. He had dealt with all of them with ease. He had also met some people who wanted to rob him during this time. However, Yi Shiwen was no ordinary person. He had easily killed all the people who had been planning on robbing him. However, these magical items and heavenly treasures weren't the main thing. The main thing was that sacred spring of life. The majority of people had arrived for it. They wouldn't have rushed over here from distant parts for anything else. It was the most precious thing. That tomb chamber had to be in the depths of the tomb. Therefore, he needed to penetrate deep inside the tomb in order to reach there. He continued to collect wealth as he ventured deeper into the tomb. An increasing number of zombies were present inside these passages. Suddenly, a loud roar came from afar. It was a screechy roar that was unique to the dead beings. It was a zombie. Yi Shiwen hadn't thought much when a red zombie suddenly appeared at a distant place. Its entire body was red, as if it had been set on flames. Ding Tong and her team were in front of this zombie. This was the same team Yi Shiwen had separated away from 3 months ago. However, only Ding Tong and Xiao Yuan were left in that small team. Other people were gone. The two hadn't been on good terms with each other in the past. However, They looked to be getting along well at this time. It seemed as if Ding Tong had seen a savior when she had seen Yi Shiwen arriving. A kind of hope flickered in her eyes. She yelled, "Yi Shiwen, thank God it's you." Both of them immediately rushed towards Yi Shiwen. However, he didn't have time to talk with them. He was staring at the big zombie in front of him with his flashing eyes. Whoosh! The zombie covered a massive distance in an instant and arrived in front of Yi Shiwen. It was dressed up in ancient clothes. Its clothes looked worn out. The human that it had once been had died inside this tomb. Subsequently, he had transformed into a terrifying zombie. However, it wasn't clear how many years ago that had happened. Nonetheless, it was a monster of sage-accomplished realm. It was extremely formidable. It was holding a big sword that was almost taller than its body. His gloomy and frantic aura was firmly locked upon Yi Shiwen. Its cultivation looked nearly the same as it was when it had been alive. "Human, you have intruded into my territory. You will bring about your own doom," the zombie said in a low and muffled voice. His hoarse voice sounded as if a sharp blade was being scratched on a glass. Clang! A metal clanging sound was heard as an incomparably sharp swordlight slashed down on Yi Shiwen. Yi Shiwen immediately raised his hand and caught that swordlight. Ding! Ripples of light waves formed on Yi Shiwen's palm. A sound like that of the bell of a big clock proliferated. It was like the sound of bombardment of metals. Yi Shiwen felt as if his arm had become slightly numb. He became secretly startled as a result. The toughness of these zombies' bodies increased to a dreadful extent after death, regardless of whether they had been humans or demon beasts, or of some other race when they had been alive. These zombies were extremely dreadful even when they depended solely upon their bodies. However, they could even challenge the ancient devil god once they transformed into drought demons. Suddenly, the Yin energy in the entire tunnel began to surge turbulently. That senior zombie shouted loudly and attacked Yi Shiwen once again. That big sword looked just like a cavalry sword. It seemed that it could behead even an exceptional ominous beast in one slash. Yi Shiwen shot a backhanded punch. A big star suddenly collided with that sword light which was surging forth. And this collision gave rise to an explosion. Bang! The sword light got crushed and faded away. "Human, how can you have such a powerful body?" A look of disbelief flashed in the dark green eyes of that zombie. This zombie had already attained spiritual wisdom. However, it was still being constricted inside this tomb. But it's also a good thing. I may be able to move a step forward and break away from this damn cage if I absorb the incredible vitality from your body. The zombie issued a ghastly sound as it looked at Yi Shiwen. Its eyes were brimming with brutality. It seemed as if it was looking at a delicious dish. "Afterwards, I will transform your corpse into a zombie, and then further transform that zombie into my puppet. Then I will insert your soul into that puppet, and keep you as my slave forever." "You are overreaching yourself." Yi Shiwen disdainfully smiled. Then, a sword intention began to condense into a big sword in his hand. This sword wasn't inferior to the big sword that was in that zombie's hand. After all, it had condensed from Yi Shiwen's own understanding of sword art. He had just reached the peak of sage realm. Therefore, he was truly dying to fight at this time. "You've long been dead, and still you're causing trouble for people. I will send you on your way to afterlife." Yi Shiwen's blazing eyes were glaring at that zombie. He unleashed his entire Bodhi's imposing aura just like a mighty wave, absolutely unrestrained. He had let it all out. Chapter 564. He has become even stronger. Xiao Yuan saw Yi Shiwen's godlike figure. He wasn't very tall and lofty, but he looked full of power and grandeur nonetheless, as if he had become an immortal. However, Ding Tong's countenance looked complicated as she nodded. She had also noticed that Yi Shiwen had become more powerful. He had transformed significantly as compared to how he was 3 months ago. In fact, they could even feel Yi Shiwen's suppressive power upon themselves. They felt as if they would be exploded by his one punch. 3 months ago, they needed to look up in order to see his existence. However, They couldn't even his figure if they looked up now. Buried heaven sword. Yi Shiwen didn't have time to think about what these two women were thinking. He had his eyes focused on that zombie. He shouted loudly and brandished his long sword. And the sword pressure spread in all directions. It seemed as if the entire world was emitting endless buzzing sounds under the suppressive power of his long sword. Clang! 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 The long sword transformed into a huge sword light in the space above. Then, it slashed out towards that zombie the next moment. The sword light pierced through the space and arrived in front of that zombie. The corpse energy that was protecting the body of that zombie looked trivial in front of Yi Zaiwen's sword light. It seemed as if this sword light could split open the world and eliminate the heaven. It was evident that the protection on the zombie's body would have been breached and shattered in a split second under this attack's might. The zombie became startled in its heart, and it immediately issued the strongest move that it knew when it used to be alive. Ghost code, the zombie shouted. Endless corpse energies suddenly burst out and proliferated in the surroundings. It seemed that they would break the world as they swept out towards Yi Zaiwen's swordlight. Bang! Two dreadful forces collided in midair, and the shock waves retracted towards both individuals. However, Yi Shiwen didn't budge. His legs were rooted to the ground. They seemed to have settled like the roots of an old tree. Apparently, he wasn't fazed even a bit. However, that zombie retreated repeatedly under this impact force. In fact, it had become impossible for it to gain a firm footing. Its eyes revealed an extremely shocked look. Its most powerful weapon was its body since it was a zombie. It had never fallen into a disadvantageous position while facing an opponent of the same level. However, the body he had been immensely proud of had become worthless in front of Yi Shiwen. In fact, it had become a joke. Ding Tong and Xiao Yuan shot a glance at each other. They saw the astonished look in each other's eyes. This zombie had been chasing them for so long, so they naturally knew how powerful it was. In fact, it could be considered as frightening. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been forced into such a distressed situation by its chase. However, this fierce monster looked nothing in front of Yi Shiwen. It had been easily repelled by him. It had been repulsed during the competition of physical strength. Just how tough had Yi Zaiwen's body become? It could repel zombies now? Yi Shiwen had been missing for the last few months, and he had reached to a terrifying level during this time. A few months' time could be considered as rather long for ordinary people. However, it was as good as a moment for the experts, especially for the outstanding experts of Sage Realm. How could this not have shocked them? Yi Shiwen hadn't planned to let off this zombie. He suddenly went a step forward, and the golden light flashed and rushed to the front of the zombie in an instant. The sword potential of the buried heaven sword hadn't decreased. It proceeded to crush the zombie. Die for me! This zombie wasn't going to let Yi Shiwen kill him. It went all out this time. It roared as the entire corpse energy of its body condensed into a country of zombies in the surroundings. There weren't any other creatures in this country. Only the zombies were running amok everywhere. This was the world of zombies. This world of zombies had appeared out of nowhere without any warning sign. It had suppressed this world. It seemed that the entire world had transformed into a zombie country. Countless zombies were supplying their magical powers in this zombie country. Everything would cease to exist in the face of this mighty force. Everything looked powerless in front of it. It seemed that this zombie had already visualized Yi Shiwen dying at its hands. Its face exposed a grim, smiling expression, and it let out a sinister laugh through its red lips. You damned human. Enjoy the flavor of the advent of corpses. The negative Yin energies were present in abundance at this place. They could be considered as the spirit energies of this passage. And they combined with the corpse energies immediately after the advent of the world of zombies. Ding Tong and Xiao Yuan had no choice but to promptly increase the thickness of the protective layers of real elemental energy on their bodies. Otherwise, they would have been poisoned to death by these corpse energies. These zombies could be considered as downright poisonous beings. Every muscle and every drop of blood in their bodies was poisonous. They were extremely toxic. Moreover, the more ferocious a zombie was, the more poisonous it would be. In fact, this was also a means of self-protection for these zombies. Is that all you've got? Yi Shiwen shouted. Then, his golden divinities began to surge as if they had been enraged by the surrounding corpse energies. His divinities had begun to boil all of a sudden. And the positive yang power spread out. It was the strongest power in the world. It seemed as if a country of gods had been formed as a result. Countless different venerable gods started to chant scriptures that had existed since ancient times inside this country of gods. This country of countless gods condensed into a god's kingdom, and collided with the zombies' kingdom which had been descending from above. Rumble! Two entirely different countries, two entirely different worlds collided at this moment. And then, the two opposing forces eroded each other. A chief zombie tried to crawl into the god's kingdom from the zombies' kingdom. However, those powerful golden gods in the god's kingdom killed that zombie, and didn't let it approach. It seemed that countless reincarnations had taken place in that instant. Countless zombies had been killed by the gods. And many gods had been ripped apart and devoured whole by the zombies. Ding Tong and Xiao Yuan trembled with fear as they saw this scene. They felt as if they were witnessing the end of the world, the twilight of the gods. However, they had also realized that it was not real. Instead, it was the visualizations of the martial arts of the two individuals that were competing and engulfing each other in order to determine who would fail to resist first. The situation seemed to have reached a stalemate. Ding Tong and Xiao Yuan couldn't decide who would win and who would be torn apart. They just hoped that Yi Shiwen would win. After all, the consequences would be too horrible for them if Yi Shiwen lost. However, they didn't get much time to think as Yi Shiwen suddenly let out a cold cry. He then stepped forth, and a golden wave surged out. Countless gods organized an army inside his golden god's kingdom, and entered the zombies' kingdom with an intention to kill. Bang! The zombies' kingdom broke down under the attacks of the countless gods. And the golden light illuminated the entire passage of the tomb. Poof! That zombie spouted a mouthful of green blood. Its strong and robust body went backwards while flying upside down. Cracks appeared on its body as a result. Its green blood gushed out of those cracks and poisoned the air in the surroundings. Also, a sizzling-like sound echoed. This is not possible. My corpse body should be invincible. That zombie couldn't believe that it had been defeated by an ordinary expert of Sage Peak Realm. In fact, it seemed as if there had been no suspense about this outcome during the course of the entire fight. After all, it hadn't had the power to fight back throughout the fight. Humph! Invincible? Don't be so full of yourself. Yi Shiwen coldly snorted. He then brandished his fist. It transformed into an incomparably large star. The huge star suppressed the world as it slammed down towards the zombie in order to crush it. Bang! The zombie didn't get enough time to escape. The fist power struck it, and its body crumbled like paper even though it was supposed to be incomparably tough. It had been destroyed and reduced to ash. Ding Tong and Xiao Yuan came over to express their gratitude when they saw that Yi Shiwen had killed this zombie. Yi Shiwen waved his hand as if it was no big deal. He then frowned and said, "How has it come to pass that only 2 of you have remained? Have the other people died?" He felt pity in his heart. Everyone in that small team had undoubtedly possessed ulterior motives. However, he had collaborated with them for a while. Therefore he felt pity for them. However, it wasn't a surprise that they had perished in battle. After all, this place was densely packed with zombies. Sage Great Perfection level experts were undoubtedly formidable. However, it wouldn't matter how formidable they were if they were to meet a strong zombie like this one. They could only manage to escape in such a situation. In fact, they could even die in the fight if they weren't careful. "No, we have been framed." Xiao Yuan gritted her teeth and said. She was looking at Yi Shiwen as if she considered him the team's pillar. She wasn't looking at him as if he was as an eyesore, the way she had looked at him initially. She had never said anything specifically against Yi Shiwen. She had been targeting Ding Tong back then, and Yi Shiwen had been taken along the ride with her. It could be said that he had been unjustly attacked. What happened? Yi Shiwen asked. It's Gong Yanjia. Xiao Yuan spoke out a name that startled Yi Shiwen. Her words were filled with resentment. Also Yu Rui. He carried us into a trap established by Gong Yanjia. He alarmed that sage accomplished level zombie which was in deep sleep. It woke up and attacked us. Gu Tian died fighting. We also nearly got killed. Yi Shiwen, you must avenge us. Xiao Yuan had included Yi Shiwen into their group as if it was the most obvious thing. Gong Yanjia hasn't died yet? Yi Shiwen was somewhat surprised. Gong Yanjia had sustained serious injuries at his hands. Still, he hadn't died at this place which was brimming with zombies, and had returned to retaliate. This was beyond his expectations. It's true. Gong Yanjia hasn't died. Moreover, his power has increased enormously. In fact, I should say that he has recovered his enormous power. Ding Tong was standing nearby. It was she who had replied this time. The fact is that Gong Yanjia had already reached the sage accomplished realm earlier. However, he had lost a fight with someone. And his cultivation realm had dropped as a result. He has arrived at this place because he wanted to find the magical things that could restore his power. Now he has found it, and his power has been restored to the peak. In fact, it has increased even further. Ding Tong's words had surprised Yi Shiwen. It's no wonder that Gong Yanjia was so strong. He was far more powerful than an ordinary sage great perfection level expert. But it turns out that he had declined from the sage accomplished realm. So he would naturally have been different. Moreover, he had merely been wary when I had revealed my tyrannical strength in front of him. He hadn't been terrified. Clearly, he had been waiting to find the divine things that he needed to restore his martial power. And that was because he would be able to treat me like an ant once he had restored his strength, just like he treated other people. Chapter 565. There was a great disparity between Sage Great Perfection Realm and Sage Accomplished Realm. Therefore, it could be said that Gong Yanjia didn't have so much confidence without any reason. It was just that he had miscalculated Yi Ziwen's strength. He had repeatedly underestimated him, and finally had to escape after sustaining serious injuries. Moreover, black-robed old Yin had been killed by Yi Shiwen. He simply hadn't anticipated this. Yi Shiwen hadn't cared too much about Gong Yanjia in the beginning. He only needed to wait until he had made the breakthrough into the Sage Peak realm. After all, he wouldn't need to worry about Gong Yanjia thereafter. However, it suddenly seemed that it wouldn't be that easy to kill Gong Yanjia. Yi Shiwen wasn't afraid of his threats. However, he found him rather disgusting. Do you know where he is now? Yi Shiwen asked. He thought to ask about Gong Yanjia's location so that he could go and kill him at first. He didn't have such a big enmity with Gong Yanjia that he would want to kill him. However, he couldn't tolerate someone scheming against him behind his back. Such an enemy was best eliminated. The two women shook their heads. They didn't know where Gong Yanji and his team had gone to after they had escaped from them. So, they didn't know about the current whereabouts of Gong Yanjia, Yu Rui, and Emogen. Then you follow me. They'll find and kill all three of them. Then all of us will feel relieved. Yi Shiwen said. The women had been seeking for help. They couldn't say that they would be able to defend themselves inside this extremely dangerous tomb despite the fact that they had the strength of Sage Great Perfection Realm. However, the situation was completely different now since they had Yi Shiwen by their side. After all, they had just witnessed Yi Ziwen's insane strength. He had defeated a senior zombie of Sage Accomplished Realm with just a few moves. They would be much safer now that Yi Shiwen was escorting them. Basically, there wouldn't be any problem in escaping unless a group of Sage Accomplished level experts attacked them from all sides. The women introduced Yi Shiwen to the situation of the last 3 months after they came to know that he had been undergoing closed-door training for the past 3 months. Yi Shiwen had probed the situation of the outside world with the help of his divine sense while he was in the closed-door training. However, he could obtain only a little bit of information. It was far less than the details that these two women had provided him. The search for the sacred spring of life had progressed to some extent. But this matter should have ended very quickly. After all, Tang Can should have obtained a great advantage because of the map that he had. However, things had turned out differently. He came inside the tomb and realized that his map was of no use. It was because the location of the sacred spring of life had changed. However, it hadn't been shifted by the people. Instead, it had shifted by itself. Some people guessed that the sacred spring of life moved on its own from time to time. And it wouldn't be easy to tell where it had migrated this time. In fact, this was a solid guess since the spiritual items could feel dangers by themselves and could hence move around. There was even a saying in this regard: the spiritual items have spiritual awareness. Therefore, this wasn't an uncommon phenomenon. Consequently, Tang Can had lost his advantage even though he possessed the map. Therefore, he had also made only a little progress. However, the main thing was the direction. Everything would go smoothly once the direction was determined. In fact, it would take a month's time at most to find the whereabouts of the sacred spring of life after the direction was determined. Yi Shiwen suddenly felt that there was a bit of problem. It wasn't that easy to find Gong Yanjia in 1 month. He obviously wasn't worried that Gong Yanjia would have escaped by now. After all, Gong Yanjia definitely wouldn't escape until the sacred spring of life got unveiled. It could be said that Gong Yanjia might have avoided Yi Shiwen when he was at the Sage Great Perfection Realm. However, he had restored his cultivation to Sage Accomplished Realm now. So, it would be strange if he were to escape. After all, his incomparably domineering personality wouldn't allow him to do so. Gong Yanjia would surely appear when the sacred spring of life showed up. His domineering and arrogant personality wouldn't allow him to be afraid of anybody now that he had reached the Sage Accomplished Realm again. And Yi Shiwen wouldn't underestimate him by thinking that he wouldn't strive for the sacred spring of life. Yi Shiwen would have to wait until the sacred spring of life showed up if he couldn't find Gong Yanjia in this 1 month. He must uproot the main cause of trouble at that time. Gong Yanjia harbored extreme hatred and resentment towards him. And it wasn't in Yi Ziwen's nature to allow such a hostile enemy to roam freely and unfettered. However, Yi Shiwen couldn't find his whereabouts in this 1 month. Perhaps Yi Ziwen's luck wasn't good or Gong Yanjia's luck was too good. The matter regarding sacred spring of life became increasingly lively as the time passed day by day. An increasing amount of news began to spread out. In fact, some news was spread out almost every day. Yi Shiwen had unceasingly collected the left-behind treasures in this 1 month. Many people had arrived in this tomb while he was in the closed-door training for 3 months. Therefore, he couldn't obtain too many treasures. However, it was still better than nothing. Moreover, everyone's focus wasn't on these treasures. Their attention was fixed on the sacred spring of life which hadn't appeared yet. Someone finally found this long-awaited sacred spring of life. They had found a small stream of spring water that was flowing out from inside a secret room. It was a very thin line of water. However, it had still been discovered. This news spread out. And it instantly caused a huge sensation among the experts that were present inside the tomb. Everyone rushed to that place in the tomb. Yi Shiwen also did so. However, he didn't show his face out in the open. Instead, he took the 2 women along with him and stood on the side. He was highly skilled in his restraining breath technique. Therefore, nobody would be able to see him even if he were to mix in with the crowd. They would have ignored him even if they walked past him. Someone could have noticed him only if they already knew his exact position. In common terms, he had become invisible after restraining his very presence. Things hadn't even begun to take shape at this time. So, he didn't want to become too impulsive by acting in advance. Yi Shiwen saw that thin stream of sacred spring of life. He couldn't help but sigh. It was apparent that an exceptionally bitter struggle would take place soon. It was clear from the flow of that spring water that there wasn't much spring water inside. In fact, it might be enough for just 1 person. However, many people had arrived here. Therefore, he was sure that a bitter struggle would take place when the time would come. This point was also visible from Tang Can's case. He wouldn't have needed to arrive here if his elder brother had extra spring water. After all, this venture would have been a needless risk in that case. Therefore, it was clear that his elder brother must not have taken away a huge amount of the spring water. There was no scope of negotiation. The treasure was enough for only one person, and all these people were ambitious and thriving. Some of them might not be looking for making progress. They might have also let it go if it were ordinary stuff. After all, sage accomplished level experts weren't easy to handle. However, how could they possibly give up on a magical treasure that could help in making the breakthrough into the great sage realm? Even Yi Shiwen wouldn't give up. He had to get hold of it. He had a premonition that it would be more difficult for him to make the breakthrough into the great sage realm as compared to an ordinary person. So, the sacred spring of life would be a big help for him. It could help him in making the breakthrough into great sage realm. It might play a crucial role in his future. Yi Mo had also advised him not to give up. Therefore, he wouldn't give up. Talking things out would be pointless in this situation. There was only one way: fight and find out who has the biggest fist. And the winner would get the sacred spring of life. Obviously, it wasn't only Yi Shiwen who could see this thing. It's so meager in quantity. I reckon that not many people would be able to obtain it even if the room opened. It may be just enough for one person's use. This matter will definitely cause a bloodbath. However, I must obtain the sacred spring of life no matter what. I'm already 1,500 years old. I will enter the condition of 5 signs of death if I don't make the breakthrough soon. I'll have no other choice at that time but to die in a seated posture. Many of these people looked middle-aged or young. However, only they themselves knew about the kind of situation they were in. The so-called phase of 5 signs of death would certainly arrive one day in a person's life. High cultivation would be of no use in that case unless one made another breakthrough. It would be too late for everything if one waited until the arrival of 5 signs of death phase of their life. The human bodhi's function would rapidly deteriorate after entering into the 5 signs of death phase. And it would be 100 times more difficult to make the breakthrough at that time. One could only sit and wait for their death if they entered this phase. Some people had found a way out of it. They had made the breakthrough once again after entering this phase. However, there was a very small possibility of this happening. The people who had entered this phase weren't on the verge of death yet. However, there wasn't any difference either. After all, they had reached a condition where there was nothing they wouldn't dare to do. And such people were obviously capable of going to insane lengths. Most people didn't want to annoy these people, and Yi Shiwen was no exception. However, Yi Shiwen didn't have any other choice at this time. Bang! A formidable aura arrived from a distant place. This person was none other than Tang Can. He had finally appeared. Yi Shiwen had found out about him just before he appeared. He was the one who had stirred up this matter in the first place. So, he would naturally arrive at this time. The Zhuyan ape, the Silver Eagle King, and that young man dressed in large white clothes also arrived one after another soon after Tang Can appeared. These 4 experts didn't delay after arriving. They immediately bombarded the entire gate. The other experts also attacked this gate one after another. Everyone understood the fact that they could get the opportunity to obtain the sacred spring of life only if they blasted this gate. Therefore, everyone was working together, at least for the time being. Yi Shiwen also attacked. However, his divine sense was wandering in the surroundings at the same time. He had to find Gong Yanjia's whereabouts. And he didn't believe that Gong Yanjia would have restrained himself from coming out here. Not too much time had passed when Yi Shiwen found Gong Yanjia and his team. They were hiding in a corner. And they had even restrained their presence. In fact, they were almost hidden inside that subspace. Gong Yanjia was also a very cunning person. He had restrained himself from attacking at present. He would move into action when those 4 sage accomplished level experts could be caught off guard. However, Yi Shiwen had the same idea. And he had found Gong Yanjia. Gong Yanjia wanted to be the oriole behind the mantis. However, he had instead become a mantis himself. Both of you will wait here until this gate opens. Defend yourselves, but don't attack. Otherwise, I won't be able to protect you. Yi Shiwen said. He was going to attack with his entire strength and fight for the sacred spring of life. And he wouldn't be able to turn back to help these two women if they also got involved. The two nodded. Both of them were experts of the sage great perfection realm. So, it wouldn't be easy to kill them if they focused on defending themselves. Bang! Yi Zaiwen's voice hadn't even faded when a loud explosion occurred. He then heard someone shouting, "The gate has opened. Begin." Chapter 566. The stone gate couldn't withstand everyone's combined attack and exploded. A burst of boundless corpse energy proliferated out and formed clouds of corpse energy inside the tomb. It looked especially gloomy and terrifying. Yi Shiwen, don't rush to the front. I have a bad feeling about this. There seems to be something inside that's making me restless. Diemo said. Yi Shiwen hadn't planned to be at the front. However, his desire to rush to the front reduced even further after hearing Yi Mo's warning. He frowned. Who could be lurking inside this ghostly place? Could it be a 10,000 years old corpse king or something? Yi Shiwen somewhat shuddered with fear as he made the guess. No matter what was inside, it had to have undergone a drastic transformation if it had any relation with being 10,000 years old. Moreover, the corpse energies were terrifying here. It wasn't clear how much richer the corpse energy here was as compared to the outside world. This was the most dreadful thing. Some ominous things might breed in such an environment. However, the other people hadn't thought this. So, they rushed in one after another. After all, they were afraid that they might not be able to grab the sacred spring of life if they slowed down. Everyone present here was a martial arts expert. Their footsteps didn't slow down even a bit. They burst into the depths of the room within a moment. They then saw the corpse energy that was spread throughout this forbidden area. It looked like a completely different world. The cave's roof was several hundred meters high from the ground. The cave was incomparably spacious. However, the majority of the area inside was concealed in darkness. The presence of strong corpse energies had blocked everyone's eyesight. Yi Shiwen was behind everyone. He heard the commotion coming from front. I found the sacred spring of life. It wasn't known who had shouted, but everyone began to push forward. Yi Shiwen got mixed in the crowd. He saw that the giant-sized Silver Eagle King had grabbed a fist-sized lump of liquid in his claws. The liquid was wrapped up in a sphere that was emitting sparkling and translucent rays of light. Everyone's gaze was fixed on it. They knew that this must be the sacred spring of life that was mentioned in legends. And the Silver Eagle King had seized it. Put down the sacred spring of life. Damn beast! Everyone abused endlessly. All kinds of attacks swept out towards the Silver Eagle King at the same time. They didn't care about anything at this time. After all, the Silver Eagle King would take away that thing if they didn't attack. Chirp! A loud chirping sound echoed at this moment. And endless rays of silver light emitted from the body of the Silver Eagle King and wrapped him up. He looked like a huge sculpture casted with silver. Bang! 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 Those attacks bombarded on the body of the Silver Eagle King one after another. However, they were blocked off by the silver rays of light on its body. Suddenly, the Silver Eagle King turned into a silver streamer of light and flew towards the exit. The experts that came in its way got cut into two halves. He attacked relentlessly and without any mercy. You damned big bird. This sacred spring of life is mine. A pair of red fists slammed down from above like meteors at this moment. Bang! The Silver Eagle King dodged the attack in that crucial moment. And a big hole made of some unknown material was opened in the floor. The Silver Eagle King's sharp gaze landed on the Zhuyan ape at this time. The Zhuyan ape was hiding in the void. The Silver Eagle King didn't get along with Zhuyan ape. And it wasn't a thing of 1 or 2 days. The Zhuyan ape had been constantly opposing him in these past few months. The Zhuyan ape let out a smile from the corner of its mouth and said, "Big bird, hand it over to me. Otherwise, you won't be able to escape today." "Do you want to collaborate with these humans?" the Silver Eagle King coldly asked. "I just want the sacred spring of life. You don't deserve it. Only this eye-catching king deserves it." The Zhuyan ape grinned. He wasn't modest by any means. "Bastards, this must be in the hands of this young master. Tang said angrily. He was very depressed at this time. This thing was supposed to fall into his hands. After all, he had the map. However, he had been forced into competing with everyone in the end. Tang immediately launched an attack. And a big hand made of spirit energies swept out towards the Silver Eagle King in order to grab him. Everyone else also attacked the Silver Eagle King at this time. Nobody cared about who the opposite party was. They just knew that they might not get anything if they didn't attack. All of them seemed to be blindfolded. They would attack anyone that held the sacred spring of life. Clang! Clang! Bang! All kinds of terrifying sounds were heard. Sounds of explosion reverberated everywhere. Yi Shiwen was behind everyone. However, he didn't hurry to attack. Instead, he was observing calmly. It seemed as if he was moving stealthily in the darkness and was prepared to attack anytime and anywhere. The Silver Eagle King had no choice but to temporarily let go of that ball of sacred spring of life under such a situation. Otherwise, he would be blasted to pieces despite of his strength. Everyone attacked each other. They refused to let the opposite party obtain the opportunity, as all of them wanted to grab that opportunity for themselves. However, nobody could obtain the opportunity while facing everyone's attack. After all, everyone was fighting over it. Bang! A sage great perfection level expert grabbed the sacred spring of life. However, he hadn't even felt happy when he was blasted into pieces. Tang finally obtained the sacred spring of life amidst the chaos. He then said, "You all get lost. This is mine." Tang roared angrily. After all, this thing belonged to him in his opinion. And it had finally fallen into his hands. Clang! A loud metal clanging sound was heard as a dreadful sword light slashed down towards Tang Can. It turned out to be that young man who was dressed in spacious white clothes. However, his handsome face was filled with seriousness at this time. Tang had no choice but to release the sacred spring of life while facing this dreadful sword light. He became extremely depressed as a result. You mustn't grab it. It belongs to this king. The Zhuyan ape grinned. He then made a move to grab the sacred spring of life. Suddenly, howl! A dreadful roar of a corpse reverberated inside the dark abyss. This terrifying howl shook the world. Then, a big hairy hand suddenly stretched out towards everyone. A sage small perfection level expert didn't get the time to defend himself and got caught. He screamed as this big hand penetrated his chest and crushed his heart. Blood gushed out from his chest, and he died a tragic death on the spot. "Damn it!" the young man dressed in spacious white clothes shouted loudly. His sword light slashed down and landed on that big hairy hand which had appeared out of the blue. Clang! The sword light couldn't cut down that big hairy hand. On the contrary, it issued a metal clanging sound. The hand didn't stop even a bit. Instead, it swept towards that young man dressed in spacious clothes in order to grab him. The sound of breaking of space reverberated as the big hand arrived near that man in an instant. The white-clothed man immediately retreated. He trod in the void, flew hundreds of feet back, and somehow avoided being grasped by this big hand. However, a few sage experts who were behind him weren't so lucky. They were grabbed and exploded on the spot. Everyone had been left dumbstruck by this sudden attack. What the hell is going on? What is this big hand? Some people were already terrified. After all, many formidable sage experts had been grabbed and killed by this hand. What is lurking inside this darkness? Everyone, we mustn't fight amongst ourselves. We must deal with this unknown enemy first. A sage great perfection level expert shouted. Everyone heard this. It indeed made sense. They shouldn't be thinking about whether they will be able to obtain the sacred spring of life or not at this time. Instead, they should be thinking about whether they will be able to save their lives or not. They were fighting for the sacred spring of life so that they could make the breakthrough. Wasn't it essentially to attain a longer lifespan? Therefore, the most important thing was to save their lives first. However, he hadn't even finished speaking when another big and hairy hand came out from the darkness. The big hand grabbed his head and smashed it. Red and white fluids splashed out of his head as a result. Everyone trembled with fear as they saw this scene. What kind of bullshit trickery is this? Show yourself. Let this king see what god or demon you are. The Juyan ape couldn't tolerate this strange scene. A pair of fists swept out, and endless flames transformed into meteors and fell into the darkness. Those strong corpse energies got burnt and evaporated as a result. Moreover, the boundless darkness reduced significantly. That area had been illuminated under the light of those meteors. And everyone had clearly seen that it was a group of monsters. There were 3 tall zombies inside the room. They were dressed as mediators of 3 different religions. They were dressed as a Taoist priest, a Buddhist monk, and a Confucian scholar respectively. However, they appeared fiendish. Spears had grown all over their bodies, and their bodies were brimming with a violent aura. Yi Shiwen was standing very far from them. However, even he could feel the thick deathly miasma from them. Moreover, it seemed that their repressed but incredible power would soon burst out. Each of these zombies was far superior to an average sage accomplished expert. Even that white-clothed young man had seen no choice but to escape at the last moment in the face of that surprise attack a moment ago. Everyone was terrified. They could feel that the strength of these 3 senior zombies was increasing every moment. They were extremely scary. Suddenly, the dark green eyes of those 3 senior zombies shone. Then they burst out towards the crowd of experts. Attack! It wasn't known who had shouted, but it suddenly aroused the morale and aspirations of a lot of powerful experts. They were very afraid of these 3 zombies. However, what other choice did they have under such conditions? They could only put everything on stake and fight together. Many experts attacked together. It could be said that this scene looked incomparably dreadful. A lot of martial arts attacks swept out at once. It was enough to make the blue dome of heaven collapse and fall to the ground. The roars of these monsters and the angry shouts of the experts reverberated inside the cave at this moment. Bang! 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 The incomparably dreadful sounds of explosion reverberated everywhere. Gong Yanjia had been hidden in the darkness. He finally moved into action at this moment. He had remained hidden for a long time in wait for such an opportunity. So, he finally moved at this time since he didn't want to miss this opportunity. His hands suddenly became big and swept towards the sacred spring of life to grab it. His face exposed a happy expression as the sacred spring of life was about to fall into his hands. All those schemes of his hadn't gone in vain. Making the breakthrough into the great sage realm would be imminent for him after getting his hands on this sacred spring of life. However, a loud shout came from afar at this moment. Gong Yanjia, don't even think of doing that. Chapter 567. Gong Yanjia, don't even think of doing that. A cyan figure suddenly appeared in front of Gong Yanjia. He stretched out a big hand towards the ball of sacred spring of life to grab it. He then grabbed it and put it inside the heavenly source mirror in front of Gong Yanjia. Gong Yanjia was stunned by this. However, his face immediately revealed an angry look, and he shouted, "It's you!" Gong Yanjia was unwilling to give up on his retaliation towards Yi Shiwen. After all, he had an arrogant and despotic temperament. However, he hadn't acted ostentatiously and showed off his powers everywhere even after making the breakthrough into the sage-accomplished realm. He was waiting for this day to come so that he could succeed in obtaining the sacred spring of life. However, he had been obstructed by Yi Shiwen when the success was only a step away from him, when only a moment was left. And Yi Shiwen had turned out to be his nemesis in this instance as well. His plan of using Yi Shiwen as cannon fodder had been ruined by Yi Shiwen in the beginning. Yi Shiwen had then defeated him and had forced him to escape. And now, he had interfered during this crucial time as well. Gong Yanjia had finally moved into action because he wanted to take advantage of this time when everyone's attention was fixed on those 3 zombies. However, he was robbed by Yi Shiwen. His scheme was very profound. However, Yi Ziwen's plan was even deeper. Yi Shiwen had waited for him to act, and then intercepted. "Yeah, it's me. It was a good plan. You had restrained yourself until now." Yi Shiwen insipidly replied. "But, you couldn't restrain yourself?" Gong Yanjia said in an ironic tone. Yu Rei and Emogen were beside him. They had become somewhat scared to see Yi Shiwen. Fortunately, they hadn't directly confronted Yi Shiwen earlier. However, they were standing on Gong Yanjia's side now. And this meant that they were standing against Yi Shiwen. They had seen Ding Tong and Xiao Yuan standing beside Yi Shiwen. They knew now that those two hadn't died back then. However, they felt a bit comfortable when they felt Gong Yanjia's intrepid aura. You dared to appear before me? The expression in Gong Yanjia's eyes changed and revealed a bitter resentment. The former calm and indifferent expression in his eyes had vanished completely. Yi Shiwen was responsible for this change. After all, how would he have become like this if it wasn't for Yi Shiwen? Why wouldn't I have dared to appear? Yi Shiwen was coldly looking at him. These two great experts suddenly attracted the attention of the majority of the people around. However, nobody was concerned about why these two men had appeared at this time. It was because the bodies of those three zombies were as tough as gold and iron. They weren't afraid of these living things. In fact, they had rushed straight into the humans' battle formation in order to kill them. Bang! The long arms of that Confucian scholar zombie arrived in front of a sage small perfection level expert. It grabbed that expert with its hands and ripped him apart into two halves. Then, it opened its mouth wide like a sacrificial bowl and swallowed the corpse of that expert. A sage great perfection level expert furiously attacked at this moment. However, the Taoist priest zombie grabbed him with his hand and crushed him to death. Then, it stuffed his mangled corpse into its mouth. This incomparably brutal scene made everyone even more frightened. However, it also made them even more united. They knew that they would also follow in the footsteps of these men if they didn't attack with their entire strength. How can they be so dreadful? They are simply invulnerable. Everyone was terrified. They couldn't believe that such scary monsters existed in the world. These sage experts were considered as domineering in the outside world. They weren't heavyweights like the great sages. However, they could still be regarded as individuals that could run amok in all directions. However, 2 or 3 such experts had been ripped apart by these monsters until now. Moreover, those experts hadn't even been able to muster the power to resist these zombies. So, it was evident that these monsters were way too frightening. It would have made sense if these monsters were great sages. After all, they also knew that there was a huge disparity between them and the great sages. However, they could feel that these monsters hadn't even reached the great sage realm. In fact, they hadn't even reached the half-step of great sage realm. They were merely at the sage accomplished realm. This had obviously shoved them in despair. However, it had also given them some hope. Anyway, these zombies weren't great sages. Otherwise, they would have had no choice but to wait for their death with their hands tied. Fortunately, Yi Shiwen warned us a while back not to rush to the front. Otherwise, the consequences would have been too horrible. Ding Tong felt very grateful at this time. She was glad that she had obeyed what Yi Shiwen had told them and hadn't gotten driven by her greedy mind to rush ahead. Otherwise, she reckoned that she would have also fallen into the hands of these monsters and gotten devoured by them as a result. The most dreadful thing wasn't being killed by them. These people had killed all the way to this place. And the women were no exception. So, she was used to the sight of killings. However, she couldn't accept being devoured so brutally. It's good that you've appeared. But don't run away now. I have to offer sacrifice with your blood today. Gong Yanjia cruelly smiled. His imposing aura had reached to the extreme. The tyrannical power of Sage Accomplished Realm had been fully demonstrated. He had reached the Sage Accomplished Realm a long time ago. But he had fallen to the Sage Great Perfection Realm because he had sustained some injuries. However, he had restored his strength now. Moreover, his strength had reached to the peak of the Sage Accomplished Realm in one fell swoop. Consequently, he was confident that nobody could defeat him now. Therefore, he was confident that he could still obtain the sacred spring of life even if he had to face so many experts. Bang! Yi Zaiwen's vital energy rushed out and formed waves of golden divinities under his feet. Then his entire body became golden. It seemed as if an ancient overlord had been reborn. Then his entire strength burst out. The complexions of the onlookers changed significantly as a result. After all, such power was too terrifying. In fact, his imposing aura didn't differ a bit from that of Gong Yanjia at this moment. Gong Yanjia's complexion turned unsightly. He had realized that Yi Shiwen had also advanced by leaps and bounds in the last few months. His cultivation had become unfathomable. He knew that this man was a persistent enemy. But the speed of his progress had surpassed his imagination. However, he didn't think anything else. Gong Yanjia's strength had restored to the peak. In fact, it had surpassed the peak. So, what if Yi Shiwen had made a breakthrough as well? Gong Yanjia attacked almost immediately. A big leg suddenly transformed into a giant mountain and slammed down towards Yi Shiwen. Gong Yanjia had undoubtedly become much more terrifying than before. After all, the martial power of the peak of Sage Accomplished Realm was unfathomably profound. He had become extremely terrifying after restoring his original strength. So, it was no wonder that he had always been very arrogant and despotic. However, Yi Shiwen also wasn't the person that he used to be a few months ago. His cultivation had also promoted from the late stage of Sage Realm to Sage Realm Peak in the last few months. So, he too had become several times more powerful than earlier. He condensed a Hanshan seal with his bare hands, and his entire arm transformed into a giant mountain range. It spanned through the air, and suddenly pounded towards Gong Yanjia's leg. Bang! Two mountains collided in midair. They had been formed of energies. So, they ferociously collided in the space along with a violent explosion. This was the most intense battle. Both sides had gone all out. Bang! Gong Yanjia's Sage Tool leg was instantly defeated by Yi Shiwen even though it had condensed into a mountain. Yi Shiwen had gained an overwhelming advantage from the beginning of the fight, just like the last time. Yi Shiwen then attacked with his entire strength. A fist swept out, transformed into a big star, and fell down. Endless murderous aura splashed out everywhere and attacked without any hesitation. He had let Gong Yanjia escape the first time. However, he wouldn't let the tiger return to his den this time. He had completely suppressed Gong Yanjia. However, he was still incomparably relaxed. In fact, he wasn't giving Gong Yanjia any room to make a comeback. Bang! Yi Shiwen soundly defeated Gong Yanjia's counterattack once again. Then he arrived in front of him. Gong Yanjia's eyes were filled with dread as well as a determination of not giving up. He was already in his most powerful condition. In fact, he was in an even better condition than his strongest state. However, he still looked vulnerable in front of Yi Shiwen. He didn't have any room to retaliate. He had become depressed after being suppressed like this. In fact, he felt like vomiting blood. Moreover, it seemed that Yi Shiwen was also slowly grasping the power of the Sage Accomplished Realm as the fight was becoming increasingly intense. He had gradually become proficient in using the peak of Sage Realm to control the fighting power of the Sage Accomplished Realm. In addition, the might of Big Bang Stardust Fist had increased even further. Die! Yi Shiwen shouted loudly. Then, the fist power exploded all the protections on Gong Yanjia's body. It then blasted upon his body once again. Poof! Gong Yanjia spouted a mouthful of blood. His body went out flying upside down. He had been battered to the extent that his body was almost falling apart. Gong Yanjia finally understood that there was a difference of cloud and mud between Yi Shiwen and him. Therefore, he no longer harbored any hopes of beating Yi Shiwen. And Gong Yanjia wasn't going to stay any longer after he had come to realize this. He immediately roared, and the real elemental energy of his entire body began to ignite frantically. He then transformed into a streamer of light, and thought to escape from the hands of Yi Shiwen. He didn't care about his two subordinates Yu Rui and Mo Zhen. The most important thing for him at this moment was to escape anyhow. Other people were insignificant in his opinion. He even wished that Yi Shiwen would target them first. This would delay Yi Ziwen's action against him, and would buy him some time to escape. However, how could Yi Shiwen give him such an opportunity? A big golden hand suddenly stretched out. It then transformed into golden clouds, and grabbed Gong Yanjia in a claw. Poof! Gong Yanjia was instantly transformed into a mass of blood fog. His soul had also been exterminated. Everyone was left stunned. This much talked about fight should have been outstanding and should have lasted for several days and nights. So, they hadn't anticipated that it would end within such a short span of time. This had instantly terrified many people. Yi Ziwen's strength had deterred the people who were getting restless to make trouble. After all, some people had seen him snatching that ball of sacred spring of life. So, they had thought that they would snatch it from him. However, would they dare to attack him now that they had witnessed his insane strength? In fact, the thought of robbing the sacred spring of life from Yi Shiwen had vanished from their minds. The battle situation on the other side had entered the most intense stage. People were unceasingly dying at the hands of these three monsters. 1/5 of the experts had perished during the short period of time in which Yi Shiwen had killed Gong Yanjia. These three zombies were like three highly efficient slaughtering machines. They had made everyone's hair stand on end. In fact, everyone had been scared witless. Chapter 568. Go to the side and die. Everyone knew that it would be a dead end if they couldn't deal with these three monsters. All of their efforts would be for naught. Screech! The Silver Eagle King issued a loud eagle cry and finally moved into action at this time. His wings fluttered and unleashed endless winds. Consequently, a huge tornado swept towards that Buddhist monk zombie who hadn't acted so far. The Buddhist monk zombie roared and summoned a Buddha. A grayish Buddha aura suddenly illuminated the world, and an image of Buddha appeared behind the Buddhist monk zombie. However, this Buddha had fiendish features. It was a corpse Buddha. The corpse Buddha opened his eyes, and it seemed as if the world had sunk into darkness within an instant. Everything seemed to have sunk into the world of zombies. Endless grayish light swept out and went up towards that tornado in order to tackle it. Rumble! Two dreadful forces suddenly collided in the space. This dreadful collision made the space around the point of collision ripple like the surface of boiling water. The space boiled and frantically distorted. Then, the ripples swept across one after another. The forces of both sides had been routed in midair. Then, the Silver Eagle King moved once again. Silver rays of light burst out from its body in the form of a ring and condensed into a huge falcon in the void. The huge falcon cried loudly and rushed towards the Buddhist monk. Roar! The Buddha that was behind that Buddhist monk zombie roared loudly. He opened his mouth like a sacrificial bowl and stretched out a big black claw towards that huge falcon in order to grab it. Bang! This was a terrifying scene. The big black claw penetrated that huge silver falcon and ripped it apart. Then, another big hand stretched out, but disappeared a second later. It seemed as if the hand had penetrated into the space. But, it reappeared a moment later. However, it was already in front of the Silver Eagle King this time. Screech! The Silver Eagle King screamed as its wings got torn apart by that big hand. Blood splashed out from his body as a result. The big hand retracted whilst holding the wings. Then, the corpse Buddha opened his mouth like a sacrificial bowl and gobbled up those wings. Everyone trembled with fear as they heard the crunch, crunch sound of bones being chewed and crushed by the corpse Buddha. One must know that the Silver Eagle King had cultivated to the pinnacle of sage accomplished realm. It could be even said that his bones were as hard as steel. However, they had been chewed and crushed by the corpse Buddha with ease. Holy crap! What kind of fucking monster is this? The Zhuyan ape couldn't take it anymore. It turned around and escaped. It had no reason to stake its life in a fight with these three monsters. It had already seen the Silver Eagle King fighting with them. Its wings had been torn apart and eaten by the corpse Buddha even though it was in the form of Silver Eagle King. The Zhuyan ape didn't want to see its own limbs torn apart and devoured as well. That would be extremely terrifying. Everyone lost their courage when they saw the Silver Eagle King's wings being shattered by the Buddhist monk zombie. The Zhuyan ape had already escaped. Nobody wanted to step forward and throw away their life. Therefore, they flew away in the direction of the gate one after another. The entire troop had gotten dispersed. All of them had rushed towards the exit one after another. Yi Shiwen quickly rushed towards the two women at a rapid speed and said, "Follow me closely. We're leaving." He didn't want to stay here and fight these three monsters either. These three monsters hadn't entered the half-step of Great Sage Realm yet. However, their strength was still unfathomable. It might be possible that they had been suppressed by the rules of Great Gas Collar. Or, they had just woken from an eternal sleep, and this was their weakest time. Yi Shiwen possessed the fighting prowess of a Heaven's Pride expert. Still, he couldn't dare to say that he could defeat them within a short time. Moreover, they would become even more ferocious once they gradually recovered. So, wasn't staying here equivalent to courting death? "Boy, hand over my sacred spring of life." Everyone tried to escape at the same time, and thus created a chaotic situation. However, the speed of those three outrageously powerful zombies was much faster than theirs. Therefore, they had to run faster than the other experts to prevent the wrath of those three monsters from falling upon them. A lot of people were thinking this, and Yi Shiwen was no exception. Therefore, the person that was looking for him at such a time could only be Tang Can. After all, he was originally the most promising contender for obtaining the sacred spring of life. This represented the so-called saying the mantis stalks the cicada unaware of the oriole behind it. Tang Can was initially the cicada, and Yi Shiwen became the oriole in the end. Therefore, Tang Can was in a very foul mood when he saw Yi Shiwen. At this time he rushed towards Yi Shiwen, and blocked his way by arriving in front of him. "Step aside or die." Yi Shiwen shouted loudly. His hands clenched into fists, and blasted away Tang Can's divine beam. It was followed by a slap. Bang! A loud sound of breaking of bones was heard as expected. It was crisp and brutal. However, the result was contrary to everyone's expectations since it wasn't Yi Shiwen who had suffered a loss. Instead, Tang Can had suffered a huge defeat. He had been slapped on his head by Yi Shiwen, and had gone out flying as a result. Tang Can had attacked moments ago, but he had already been defeated by Yi Shiwen in an effortless manner. His strength was apparently not as good as that of Gong Yanjia. Gong Yanjia's demeanor was arrogant and domineering. However, he was at the top when it came to strength. He was a true powerhouse of the sage-accomplished realm. He was second only to the Heaven's Pride experts in terms of fighting prowess. This was why he had the confidence to behave in an arrogant and despotic manner. However, Yi Shiwen had quickly realized that Tang Can was far weaker than Gong Yanjia. Therefore, there was no comparison between him and a person like Yi Shiwen who stood bravely over a mountain of corpses and ocean of blood. They just weren't on the same level. Moreover, Yi Shiwen was in a moment of desperation right now. So, he didn't hold back even a bit, and attacked with his entire strength. The two individuals' attacks set off an incomparably dreadful storm. It swept out layer upon layer of energy just like sea waves. Tang Can screamed, and suddenly spouted a mouthful of blood. His body went out flying upside down the next moment. It wasn't clear how many of his bones had been fractured as a result. He landed at the edge of the fleeing troop, and was immediately grabbed and torn apart by the Taoist priest zombie. He screamed endlessly as his body got torn into two halves. Then his body was devoured. Nobody was in a mood to sympathize with this powerful person that used to be in the limelight. However, their opinion about Yi Shiwen had immediately changed. He had become an exceptionally fierce person in their eyes since he had slaughtered two sage accomplished level experts in succession. They had started taking him to be as ferocious as those three zombies that were pursuing them. A lot of people had been eyeing the sacred spring of life that was in his hands. However, this thought cooled down when they saw this scene. After all, they had realized that their small tricks wouldn't work on him. Yi Shiwen could feel that the auras of those three zombies were becoming increasingly formidable. As if someone had just awakened from a deep sleep. Getting increasingly scary. Yi Shiwen, I'm afraid an extraordinary person may be buried inside this tomb. And perhaps, these three zombies were there to guard the inner chamber of this tomb. You people have woken up these three monsters by bursting into the tomb. Guillemot said, I can feel that some extraordinary being is lying therein. So, it would be better if you quickly left this place. The faster the better, The farther you go the better it is. Yi Shiwen nodded. He also didn't want to stay here. Yi Ziwen's speed was extremely fast. His speed had maintained at the peak even though he was carrying 2 individuals. He overtook the majority of people and reached near the gate in an instant, like a golden flash. However, he suddenly found out that the terrifying auras of those 3 monsters had firmly locked upon his body. They were pursuing him tightly and were getting closer. It was evident that they didn't wish to let him go. Those 3 zombies were like 3 heavy tanks. The experts in their way either got torn apart or went out flying. It was hard to tell whether these experts were dead or alive after being run over. The 3 zombies had been happily slaughtering these experts. However, they had suddenly started to ignore these experts and had made Yi Shiwen their primary target. Yi Ziwen's devil wings were an incredible magical technique, and his agility skill was extremely quick. It wasn't clear how much distance he had traveled in an instant, just like a lightning flash. However, these 3 zombies had also been extremely ferocious individuals when they were alive. Therefore, each of them had excellent agility skill of their own. They also overtook the majority of experts in an instant. You had it coming. This guy has dared to rob the sacred spring of life. He deserves to be chased to the end of the world. The Zhuyan ape wasn't very far. It had noticed that the target of these 3 zombies was Yi Shiwen now. Therefore, it started to take pleasure in Yi Ziwen's misfortune. The fact that it couldn't obtain the sacred spring of life was eating him inside. However, it was no longer depressed because of this fact. On the contrary, it felt glad because those 3 zombies would have been chasing it instead of Yi Shiwen if it had taken away the sacred spring of life. And it reckoned that they would have caught him by now since its agility skill wasn't good enough. In fact, it would have been dead by now. Soon, the other experts also felt glad as they also found out that these 3 zombies were chasing Yi Shiwen. They promptly got out of the way so that they didn't get injured. Those 3 zombies didn't have any interest in them for the time being. Everyone got ignored apart from a few unlucky ones that came in the way of those zombies. These experts were suddenly feeling glad that they hadn't snatched the sacred spring of life. Otherwise, they would have died without a doubt. Yi Shiwen felt that those zombies were getting increasingly close to him. Moreover, their auras became increasingly powerful as they approached him. 3 ice-cold and formidable auras had firmly locked upon him. It was needless to say that it seemed that they wouldn't give up until they dismembered his body into 10,000 pieces. They roared again and again, and their ominous energy soared everywhere. The devil wings were a top-tier agility technique. However, Yi Shiwen was merely at the peak of Sage Realm. Those 3 monsters that were behind him had been suppressed by the rules of the Great Gas Collar. Otherwise, it wasn't clear what grade of monsters they were. In addition, their agility techniques were no joke. They were catching up little by little. This is bad. We will get caught sooner or later if things go on like this. Yi Shiwen fully unleashed his devil wings. Wind and thunder loudly swept out from them. And endless wind and thunder power surged towards those zombies that were behind him. He didn't wish to give up the sacred spring of life. However, he didn't wish to get caught either. Therefore, he could only use such distractions to increase the distance between him and the zombies, and buy some time for himself. The speed of the 3 zombies was extremely high. They had approached the tomb's exit in the blink of an eye. There was a whole wide world outside as long as Yi Shiwen managed to get out. However, could the worst come to the worst? Could they chase him even if he escaped from the Great Gas Collar? Chapter 569. It seemed that those 3 zombies had also thought about this thing. Therefore, they roared furiously, and all kinds of corpse power techniques swept towards Yi Shiwen. Bang! 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 3 dreadful attacks got stopped by the heavenly source mirror. But the huge explosions had opened a hole in the protective barrier of the heavenly source mirror, and a part of the attack swept in through the gap. However, could it pose any threat to a person like Yi Shiwen? Yi Shiwen barged out of the tomb's main exit in a flash. He then turned around, and he saw that those 3 zombies were just roaring angrily near the exit. However, they didn't dare to step out of the tomb. Apparently, they were afraid of something. Yi Shiwen finally heaved a sigh of relief. These zombies were extremely scary. They wouldn't have allowed him to leave the Great Gas Collar if they hadn't been trapped inside the tomb. Perhaps they would have eventually caught up with him. And Yi Shiwen couldn't have avoided facing them at that time. The two women finally breathed a sigh of relief after getting rid of these terrifying monsters. They had cultivated to the sage great perfection realm. So, they could be also considered as experienced and knowledgeable individuals. However, these three zombies were the most terrifying creatures that they had come across in their entire lifetimes. Therefore, they were 100% sure that they wouldn't have been able to come out alive if it hadn't been for Yi Shiwen. Other people were left dumbstruck since only these three individuals had managed to escape. Everyone had thought that they would be able to escape since these three zombies had begun to chase Yi Shiwen. However, Yi Shiwen had managed to escape, and these three zombies had been stopped at the gate of the tomb. This had made them so depressed that they wanted to die. They had initially been taking joy in Yi Shiwen's hardship. However, they had become extremely depressed now, so much so that they felt as if they were going crazy. That Juyin Ape had been gloating the most at first. However, he had now been entrapped inside the tomb by the three zombies. Yi Shiwen and those three zombies were extremely fast. However, the other experts weren't much slower. They didn't get enough time to stop their forward momentum and consequently bumped into the zombies. This led to another bloody massacre. There had been a narrow gap in the three-echelon formation that was laid out by those three zombies. And those experts that had wanted to escape thought that they could manage an escape from that gap. However, it was as difficult as ascending to the heaven. Clang! A sky-shaking sword light suddenly camouflaged the horizon entirely. Boundless sword beams dazzled everyone, and energy surged about. Then, a white figure rushed out of the tomb like a streamer of light. It was that white-clothed youth. He possessed an extremely outstanding sword technique. Countless sword lights had burst out from his body, and he had forcibly escaped from the hands of those three dreadful zombies. Yi Shiwen frowned. He hadn't been able to see through the cultivation of this white-clothed young man this entire time. His cultivation was extremely strong, and some of his attacks looked beyond the capacity of an average sage accomplished level expert. Yi Shiwen, this man might have lowered his cultivation in order to enter the Great Gas Collar, Yemo said. His real cultivation is likely at the half-step Great Sage realm. Yi Shiwen understood Yi Mo's words clearly. It had happened once that a great sage expert with suppressed cultivation was besieged and killed by people. However, that didn't mean that such a thing wouldn't occur again, especially if there were enough benefits on the line. The sacred spring of life and a seat in the top inheritances of the Great Gas Building were examples of such benefits. These things were attractive even for the great sage experts. Therefore, it wasn't impossible that a great sage would suppress their cultivation and come in. Unexpectedly, that Juyin Ape was the next one to attempt exiting the room after this man. It transformed into flames and rushed out while cursing. The Taoist priest zombie behind him repeatedly slashed the sword that he was holding in his hand and unleashed layer upon layer of Tao-based attacks. It seemed that he would cleave the Juyin Ape into two halves. The Juyin Ape didn't dare to stay there. He quickly escaped. However, the Silver Eagle King which was behind him wasn't so lucky. It got devoured by the Buddhist monk zombie. Its entire body was chewed into several pieces and was then swallowed by the zombie. It was a terrifying and gory scene. Not even 2 out of 10 experts that had gone inside for the treasure hunt managed to come out alive. This news had shaken the entire Great Gas Collar. Not all experts knew about the sacred spring of life at first. In fact, a considerable number of experts didn't know that a thing like sacred spring of life even existed. Moreover, the majority of experts that knew about it had consciously kept this place a secret. After all, nobody wanted more people to arrive here and compete with them. However, they spoke out about this matter one after another without any hesitation after it had ended with the sacred spring of life falling into Yi Shiwen's hands. In addition, some sinister people had fanned the flames behind the scenes. As a result, many experts were looking for Yi Shiwen at this time. Almost all the experts that had arrived in the Great Gas Collar were sage experts. And who among them wouldn't want to advance a step ahead in the future and enter the Great Sage realm? After all, the strength of a person would advance by leaps and bounds after they entered the Great Sage realm. Also, their lifespan would increase by double. Most importantly, their status would be entirely changed after they entered the Great Sage realm. They would become an absolute existence in the universe. Suddenly, everyone in the Great Gas Collar was discussing about that lump of sacred spring of life, and also about Yi Shiwen. Gee, that boy is very lucky. That lucky bastard has obtained the sacred spring of life. Lucky bastard? I see it as misfortune. It's hard to say how many people have issued statements and asked him to obediently surrender the sacred spring of life. Otherwise, they would kill him. Kill him? I'm afraid it's not that easy. A small team of experts had found that guy day before yesterday. There was even a sage accomplished level expert in that group. However, only one of them survived in the end, and that person had to escape in a distressed situation. In fact, this man also wouldn't have survived if that Yi Shiwen hadn't left him alive as a warning for others. This guy is a cruel and merciless lord. This matter had become sensational. However, it started to cool down with the passage of time. Undoubtedly, many people were eyeing the sacred spring of life. However, the majority of people hadn't come to the Great Gas Collar to obtain it. The majority of people had arrived for the Great Gas Building. Half-year had passed, and the Great Gas Building was on the verge of opening. The majority of people had arrived to obtain the top 10 seats in the Great Gas Building. Everyone had begun to move closer towards the Great Gas Building since it was about to open. Many streamers of light could be seen sweeping across the sky at this time. The Great Gas Building was an extremely tall building that had stretched beyond the clouds. However, it looked simple and unadorned from afar. The atmosphere inside the Great Gas Collar was exuding endless divine beams and purple mist at the moment. This place was the center of the entire Great Gas Collar. Demon beasts and human experts had arrived in abundance here. 3 figures arrived from the distance while treading on rainbow lights. It turned out to be a man with 2 women on either side of him. The man was dressed up in cyan clothes. He possessed handsome facial features. Those 2 beautiful women had surrounded him from either side. This was the team of Yi Shiwen, Ding Tong, and Xiao Yuan Yuan. Half-year has passed, and it's finally going to open now. Yi Shiwen looked afar at the Great Gas Building. He was deeply moved by the sight. He had used the majority of the last half-year's time for consolidating his Sage Peak realm and firmly establishing his foundation. He had always used a stable low-level realm for handling high-level fighting prowess. This had compelled him to lay a solid foundation. His foundation had become polished and exceptionally solid after half-year's tempering. Now, there was no risk of falling back. His cultivation had also fully reached the peak of Sage Realm after tempering for last half-year. He was just 1 step away from entering the Sage Small Perfection realm. This had given him the confidence to arrive here and compete for a seat of Great Gas Building. Yi Shiwen and Yi Mo had together analyzed the matter of the Great Gas Building. The individuals with strength above Sage Realm weren't allowed to enter the Great Gas Collar. However, it wasn't necessary that only people with Sage Realm strength could enter this place. The experts of Half-Step Great Sage Realm or Great Sage Realm could also enter as long as they suppressed their cultivation. The Great Sages had an image of being proud and complacent individuals. However, they were afraid that they might get besieged by people like that one time earlier. However, it wasn't impossible either. These great sages were on the same level as sage accomplished level experts after suppression. However, they were still far more powerful than ordinary sage accomplished level experts in terms of martial power and skill of strength utilization. Therefore, these experts were the most troublesome ones. Many ice-cold gazes swept over Yi Shiwen as soon as he arrived. These people obviously weren't welcoming to a new person's arrival since it might decrease their chances of obtaining a seat. There were only 10 seats in the Great Gas Building. So, it was already a very insignificant number in the sense wherein so many experts had gathered. A person himself had a meager opportunity. A few people had the confidence that they could kill the others and make a way out. However, the majority of people were planning to take advantage of the chaos and cut a bloody path out of the battlefield in order to obtain one seat. Yi Shiwen was calm, and his complexion was normal while facing these gazes. However, Ding Tong and Xiao Yuan weren't at ease like him. They had followed Yi Shiwen on many expeditions in the last half-year. And they had also consolidated their strength of Sage Great Perfection Realm. In fact, they could enter the Sage Accomplished Realm at any time. Therefore, their strength couldn't be considered as weak. However, many of these gazes belonged to Sage Accomplished level experts. There hadn't been many experts of Sage Accomplished Realm initially. However, the news of the opening of Great Gas Collar had attracted many top players of Sage Realm from the nearby star fields. Consequently, there were so many experts assembled here that it seemed like a sea of experts. Yi Shiwen saw Sage Accomplished level experts wherever he looked. Some of them were strong while some were weak. However, almost everyone's aura was terrifying. These auras were much more terrifying than that of those Sage Accomplished level experts that he had seen inside the tomb. This was because only a small number of people knew that there was a sacred spring of life present in that tomb. It wasn't like this place. Every expert's focus was fixed on this venue. Yi Shiwen, these people don't seem like the friendly bunch. Yi Mo clicked his tongue and said, "It seems that obtaining a seat is impossible if attempted peacefully. I wasn't planning to obtain a seat in a peaceful manner in the first place. I must seize a place, and I don't care if I have to cause a bloodbath to do so." Yi Shiwen narrowed his eyes and replied. This matter was doomed to be messy. A lot of visions that contained killing intentions for the green-scaled fruit swept out in the surroundings. You're that Yi Shiwen, aren't you? Hand over the sacred spring of life, and it'll spare your life. You don't deserve to keep it. An ice-cold voice suddenly sounded from afar. Chapter 570. You're that Yi Shiwen, aren't you? Hand over the sacred spring of life, and it'll spare your life. You don't deserve to keep it. A big guy with a red beard came from afar while treading the rainbow light. The boundless aura he brought along with him was surging about. He looked extremely ferocious. He was a senior expert of Sage Accomplished Realm. His face was brimming with confidence at the moment. He coveted the sacred spring of life that was in Yi Ziwen's possession. After all, this treasure could help him in making the breakthrough into the great Sage Realm. Therefore, it was the most important thing for him. The look in the eyes of this big guy with red beard appeared ice-cold. He looked aloof and detached from worldly affairs. Moreover, the manner in which he had spoken had made it seem as if he was giving an order. Yi Shiwen was a nobody of Sage Realm peak in his eyes. He was merely an ordinary person, merely an ant. And he had still dared to appear here. Wasn't this a golden opportunity bestowed upon that expert by the heavens? Other people hadn't paid attention to Yi Shiwen yet. Otherwise, they would have confronted Yi Shiwen, and then snatched the sacred spring of life from him. After all, the sacred spring of life was like a ticket that could take a person directly to the great Sage Realm. Therefore, this big guy definitely wouldn't give up. What? He is Yi Shiwen? This boy is very audacious. He has dared to come to this place. I would have found some safe place in the Great Gas Collar and undergone closed-door training for several hundred years if I were him. After all, things become entirely different after one has made the breakthrough into the Great Sage Realm. This guy has always been extremely audacious. He has obtained the sacred spring of life. But he still isn't satisfied. Now, he is coveting one of the 10 seats. He is asking for it. God knows how many people are eyeing his sacred spring of life covetously. And now, he has been confronted by an evil guy like Ran Hongbin. Many people knew about Yi Shiwen. So, they casted their sharp gazes on him after his identity got exposed by that big expert with red beard. The allure of the sacred spring of life was very strong. And these people had great self-confidence. They were ambitious and vigorous. They believed that Yi Shiwen was like a child who had arrived in a bustling street with a piece of gold in his hands. He was simply asking to be robbed. Many eyes among them contained a look of disdain. What was a trivial person of Sage Realm peak in front of them? They didn't believe the rumor that a Sage accomplished level expert had lost at Yi Ziwen's hands. In fact, this absurd rumor was laughable to them. Fuck off. Yi Shiwen spoke only these two words in the face of the threatening and imposing aura of Ran Hongbin. Suddenly, the entire place went silent. They had anticipated all kinds of possibilities in this situation. They had also thought that Yi Shiwen might refuse. However, they had never expected that he would refuse so blatantly, and with such contempt at that. Ran Hongbin became furious. He could tell that the gazes in the surroundings contained an element of mockery for him at the moment. This young man before his eyes was as trivial as an ant. However, he had dared to tell him to fuck off in front of so many people. This was simply intolerable. Ran Hongbin shot a punch. It came with an incomparably overbearing palm shadow as it fell down towards Yi Shiwen from the sky. He had attacked with his entire strength and hadn't held back even a bit. In fact, it seemed that his attack would smash Yi Shiwen to death. The drumming sound of thunder reverberated in the entire sky and proliferated in all directions. This was Ran Hongbin's famous technique, the Thunderclap Tyrant Fist. The fist's power was enormous and mighty. It seemed as if a thunder dragon which had been lurking in the clouds was roaring and coming down to kill Yi Shiwen. Yi Shiwen is done for. This Thunderclap Tyrant Fist is a famous technique of a certain star field. I've heard about the incredible might of this fist technique. Ran Hongbin has obtained just an incomplete version of this technique. However, it still possesses enormous might since he has practiced it to the peak. It seems like the god of thunder himself has incarnated. What a pity! This boy had just appeared, and now he is about to die. The sacred spring of life will change hands this time. After that, it won't be that easy to snatch it from Ran Hongbin's hands. Almost everyone was optimistic about Ran Hongbin. Yi Shiwen looked like a debutante in front of Ran Hongbin who had long been famous. Yi Shiwen simply wasn't on the same level in their opinion. Moreover, Ran Hongbin hadn't underestimated Yi Shiwen. He had straightaway used the killing move of Thunderclap Tyrant Fist in order to crush Yi Shiwen. Yi Shiwen looked like a small boat on a mighty wave in the face of Ran Hongbin's stunning fist attack. He swayed up and down, and it seemed that he might get annihilated any time under this dreadful fist power. Audacious! A white-clothed young man was watching this fight from above a big tree at a faraway place. He slightly raised the corner of his mouth and drew a smirk. He then spat out these few words. However, it wasn't clear whether he had said it for Yi Shiwen or Ran Hongbin. Yi Shiwen would be able to identify this white-clothed young man if he were to see him. He was the same young man who had displayed the sky-shaking sword lights earlier. Yi Mo had guessed that his cultivation might have already surpassed the Sage Realm. In fact, Yi Mo believed that he had suppressed his cultivation to arrive here. Yi Shiwen slightly narrowed his eyes. The gazes that were hovering around didn't look very friendly. It seemed that these people were planning to snatch the sacred spring of life from his hands. And it appeared that they weren't ordinary. Ding Tong had advised Yi Shiwen not to compete for the inheritance seats of the Great Gas Building. After all, his arrival would certainly provoke many people that coveted the sacred spring of life. However, Shiwen hadn't paid attention to it. Everything was rather simple for him. He followed a simple rule: sort out the ones who are ambitious. Yi Shiwen finally moved into action at this time while facing the overwhelming fist attack. He shot a punch, and it drifted forward smoothly. In fact, it seemed as if a light feather was drifting amidst a collapsing mountain. However, this drifting light feather immediately shattered the momentum of that collapsing mountain and rendered it ineffective. It had looked slow. However, it was extremely quick. It had instantly defeated the fist power of the Thunderclap Tyrant Fist. Ran Hongbin had looked carefree until this moment. However, he was left stunned now. He was a peerless expert. It wasn't known how many enemies he had killed. He had reached this far by braving through countless bloody battles. Naturally, he possessed a rich fighting experience. However, he had been greatly startled when he saw that Yi Shiwen had effortlessly routed his fist power. This was clearly the power of the realm he dreamed of, lifting lightweight as if it's heavy realm. He had made the breakthrough into Sage realm many years ago, and he had already mastered the lifting heavy weight as if it's light technique. A mountain in his hands would appear as light as a large feather. However, he could never obtain this power of breaking the enormous momentum of a collapsing mountain with a feather as if it was nothing. He might be able to achieve the lifting lightweight as if it's heavy technique in the future. However, it would still be impossible for him to reach to the same level of brute strength as Yi Shiwen and pull off such a thing. His complexion suddenly changed as he realized this. He hadn't underestimated this man in front of him. He had attacked with his entire strength from the get-go. He had showed no mercy. So, it couldn't be said that he had underestimated Yi Shiwen. However, he had failed to figure out Yi Ziwen's fighting prowess in the beginning. Yi Ziwen's fighting prowess could in fact be placed in the Sage Accomplished realm as per his move just now. Impossible! How could you possibly master this realm? Ran Hongbin couldn't help but blurt out. He couldn't conceal the shock in his heart. He knew this realm entirely well. It had nothing to do with strength. It might be possible that even a great sage expert couldn't reach the edge of this realm. On the other hand, this insignificant man had grasped this realm completely. Many years had passed. Yi Shiwen was no longer in the initial stage where he had only half knowledge of this realm. Now, he could freely enter and exit the lifting heavy weight as if it's light realm and lifting lightweight as if it's heavy realm. And he could smoothly switch between these realms as well. Ran Hongbin's complexion had turned unsightly. He didn't feel as confident since he had seen Yi Shiwen attacking abilities now. He hadn't underestimated Yi Shiwen initially. Other people couldn't see, but he could feel how ferocious Yi Shiwen was. Bang! His body suddenly shook violently, and his entire real elemental energy began to surge. It seemed as if he had transformed into thunder. A crackling sound echoed from his body. He was inside an endless pool of thunder. It seemed as if a mighty god of thunder had incarnated. All kinds of ancient spells had emerged around him. A fist swept out and transformed into a giant thunder dragon. That shadow of a giant dragon mounted the clouds and roared. It then shrouded Yi Shiwen. It seemed that it would immediately devour him. He had unleashed his entire strength. He hadn't held back even a bit. A mantis trying to stop a chariot. Yi Shiwen sneered. A big hand suddenly stretched out. This hand was a blend of 3 palm techniques: Thousand Stars Tyrant Palm, Fire Clouds Falling Sky Hand, and Control Crane's 7 Divine Hands. Yi Shiwen had nearly deduced these techniques to perfection. Yi Shiwen had blended a few big palm techniques in an instant. Only he could pull off something like this. In fact, it would be extraordinary if other people managed to practice even one of them to the pinnacle. Bang! Yi Ziwen's big golden hand and Ran Hongbin's thunder dragon suddenly collided in the sky. The terrible collision issued boundless shock waves. Ran Hongbin's eyes opened wide when he saw that Yi Ziwen's big golden hand had penetrated all the obstructions in a flash. Yi Shiwen grabbed the thunder dragon and clutched its neck. It seemed as if he was holding a viper in his hand. Bang! Yi Ziwen's golden hand exerted pressure and crushed that thunder dragon. It disintegrated into small pieces just like paper paste and transformed into a mass of thunder and lightning. Ran Hongbin's offensive crumbled in an instant after that thunder dragon got strangled by Yi Shiwen. It must be known that the thunder dragon was the nucleus of his fist technique. It was also his strongest point. But Yi Shiwen possessed vicious insight. So, he had understood that it was Ran Hongbin's most crucial aspect. An ordinary person couldn't do anything even if they figured out this weakness of their opponent. It was indeed the central part. However, it was also the strongest part. Therefore, they couldn't annihilate it even after knowing about it. However, Yi Shiwen was different. He had the power to crush it in an instant. Yi Shiwen had routed Ran Hongbin's offensive in an instant. He then arrived in front of Ran Hongbin amidst the sparks of electric light. Impossible! Ran Hongbin shouted. He couldn't believe that he had been outdone by a nobody of Sage Realm peak. This had simply subverted his outlook of the world. However, Yi Shiwen didn't wish to explain it to him. He just wanted to make an example out of Ran Hongbin in order to let the other covetous people know that they should drop the idea of fighting him if they cherished their lives. Bang! Yi Ziwen's incredible fist power pounded upon Ran Hongbin's body. Ran Hongbin screamed as he got transformed into a mass of blood fog. Both his body and soul had been destroyed. Chapter 571. There was a pin-drop silence on the scene. A vast area in the vicinity of the Great Gas Building was completely silent. It seemed that even the sound of breathing could break this tranquility. The fight between Yi Shiwen and Ran Hongbin had attracted the gazes of countless people. It was a fight between a giant and an ant in their opinion. They had believed that defeating Yi Shiwen would be as easy as blowing off dust. In fact, they wouldn't have had any interest in watching this fight if it hadn't involved the sacred spring of life. However, Yi Shiwen, who should have been crushed to death, was in perfect condition after the fight. But Ran Hongbin, who was a colossus in their opinion, had been slaughtered. This outcome had simply subverted their whole outlook of the world, life, and their personal experiences. Driving full speed against the traffic wouldn't be as scary as this outcome. An expert of Sage Realm Peak had effortlessly killed a Sage Accomplished level expert. What would these people do if such dark horses were to move unhindered in this world? Yi Ziwen's eyes swept across everyone like an electric current. He had resorted to extreme methods because he wanted to warn these people. They must think properly if they were planning to snatch the sacred spring of life from his hands. Otherwise, they would have to pay the price with their own lives. This method was straightforward and violent. However, it was very effective. Yi Shiwen had killed Ran Hongbin at a lightning speed. He hadn't fooled around at all. And this had thoroughly deterred all those people who were ready to make a move. It should be mentioned that the majority of people had been coveting the sacred spring of life. Yi Ziwen's cultivation was only at the Sage Realm Peak. Therefore, they had felt as if a child had come to a market area with a piece of gold in his pocket. Consequently, that child had been surrounded by the bad gazes of all the adults. However, they soon found out that even several adults couldn't rival this child's skills. This had shocked the people who had been planning on seizing the sacred spring of life. In fact, those experts of Sage Great Perfection Realm and Sage Small Perfection Realm had immediately stopped thinking about this matter. After all, could they still dare to provoke this monster? Many people pondered. It's no wonder that this man has dared to arrive here with such confidence. He must have some big reliance. He might look weak at first glance. However, he is a merciless lord of death. Ding Tong and Xiao Yuan were also thinking so. They had seen Yi Shiwen killing Sage Accomplished level experts in the last few months. However, he hadn't killed them so easily in the beginning. He was very powerful at that time as well. However, he didn't possess such loftiness at that time. Now, it seemed as if a Sage Accomplished level expert was basically nothing before him. The powerful Ran Hongbin would have shaken the entire world with his might if he had been placed in the world outside. However, he had met with such a humiliating death at Yi Ziwen's hands. He couldn't withstand even 3 moves. He had been killed by Yi Shiwen in a flash. Everyone was left dumbstruck as they witnessed this insane strength. They had never seen such a formidable expert of Sage Realm Peak before. In fact, they were thinking that even the elders of their sects might not be a match for him. This man was way too strong. Ding Tong and Xiao Yuan belonged to different sections. However, they had the same opinion on this matter. He is that Yi Shiwen. A man was quietly standing in a corner in the shade of a mountain. His gaze penetrated through dozens of miles and fell upon Yi Ziwen's figure. The distance of dozens of miles was no big deal for experts with high cultivation. These were the people of the dominating Heaven Dojo. They were led by a middle-aged man who had robust facial features. He looked similar to King Tai. The middle-aged man looked at Yi Shiwen. His eyes were filled with bitter hatred because he was none other than King Tai's father, King Yi. King Tai was his most beloved son. He had nurtured him to be the future lord of the clan. He could have become the leader of the dominating Heaven Dojo, or even the Great Gas City. He was the one who could have carried forward his legacy. However, he had died at Yi Zaiwen's hands. King Yi had been devastated when he had heard this news. After that, only boundless hatred for Yi Shiwen was left in his heart. The rumors about Yi Shiwen had continued to become more and more intense in the last few months. And he was the one who had been pulling the strings behind the scenes and secretly spreading these rumors. Yi Shiwen, I must kill you. King Yi clenched his teeth in extreme anger and said, I'll use your head as sacrifice so that my son's soul rests in peace. Yi Shiwen had always been sensitive to gazes. However, the extreme hatred in this gaze had made him even more alert. Therefore, he had almost immediately noticed King Yi even though the latter had been hiding in a corner. Yi Shiwen, these people aren't looking at you with good intentions. It is obvious that they want to kill you. You must be careful, Yi Mo alerted Yi Shiwen. Yi Shiwen frowned. He took a step forward and crossed dozens of miles in one go. He had arrived in front of King Yi in an instant. He then swept his vision across all the people of the Dominating Heaven Dojo. I didn't know that the people of Dominating Heaven Dojo are still being haunted by the ghost of the past. He smirked. The people of Dominating Heaven Dojo wouldn't be after me just because I had snatched the items from King Tai in the auction. I'm almost certain that these people have received the news about what had happened later on. Otherwise, they wouldn't be looking at me with so much hatred in their eyes. The killing intention flickered in Yi Zaiwen's heart as he thought about this. These people of Dominating Heaven Dojo weren't going to leave him alone. He had anticipated that he might have to face a great sage expert's attack after getting out of here. And his anger grew thicker after thinking this. Yi Shiwen, you've killed my son. I won't spare you. King Yi's anger soared as he said. He was staring at Yi Shiwen with his ice-cold vision, just like a wolf. He was wishing that he could dismember Yi Zaiwen's body into 10,000 pieces. Your son has only himself to blame for his death. There is no reason to pity his death. Yi Zaiwen's facial expression turned ice-cold as he replied. What did you say? King Yi pounced towards Yi Shiwen like a wild beast. The universe turned upside down in an instant. Seemingly inexhaustible deadly lights swept out towards Yi Shiwen. It was a killer move. He had used such a move because of two reasons. First, he had bitter hatred for Yi Shiwen in his heart. Second, he had seen Yi Zaiwen's formidable fighting prowess a moment ago. So, he didn't wish to give Yi Shiwen any opportunity to counterattack. He must kill him quickly. However, Yi Shiwen was already prepared to face such an attack. Therefore, he was prepared since the beginning as to what he should do if this man suddenly attacked. Bang! Yi Zaiwen's big hand crushed all the deadly lights and offensives. Those deadly lights and offensives couldn't budge him. In fact, they couldn't even change his facial expression. Bang! 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 The sounds of explosion echoed in everyone's ears. An earth-shattering sound reverberated every time the two figures collided in the sky. The sounds of explosion shook the entire world, and energy proliferated everywhere. King Yi was the leader of the Dominating Heaven Dojo. He was far stronger than King Tai. In fact, even Ran Hongbin might not be a match for him. Yi Shiwen attacked incisively. A big hand swept out, and the shadow of his palm covered the entire sky. King Yi had also gone all out on the other side. He launched an attack towards Yi Shiwen with his entire strength. The two were locked in the fight for a moment. Suddenly, the entire world turned quiet. The divine beams had dispersed in all directions. After all, Yi Shiwen had grabbed King Yi's neck with his hand. He had firmly clutched his neck, just like an iron hoop. Then, the killing intention surged up in Yi Shiwen's heart. After all, King Yi harbored a very heavy killing intention for him. So, how could Yi Shiwen leave behind a trouble for the future? Yi Shiwen tightened his grip. And it became even more difficult for King Yi to breathe as a result. His face turned purple, and he started to appear even more sinister. His soul had also been imprisoned by Yi Shiwen. Consequently, he couldn't mobilize his real elemental energy. He looked like an ordinary person at this moment. He would die in a moment if Yi Shiwen increased the pressure on his neck. The sage experts were above the ordinary people. However, they still had this weakness. Stop! Suddenly, an arrogant voice came from afar. And a roughly 20 years old handsome man fell from the sky the next moment. He was dressed in a magnificent robe. His fair face carried traces of arrogance. He disdainfully looked at Yi Shiwen and said, "Stop. Who are you? Why do you want to interfere in this matter?" Yi Shiwen asked vigilantly. He wanted to exterminate these people from the dominating Heaven Dojo. There is a so-called saying, when the weeds are not eliminated along with the roots, they grow once again in the spring wind. Everyone understood this saying. These experts of dominating Heaven Dojo might scheme against him in the future if he ignored them now. And Yi Shiwen couldn't tolerate this thing. Therefore, he had taken the initiative against them. It is better to get rid of the dangers as early as possible. This was Yi Ziwen's principle. "Humph. I'm the guardian of this great gas building. You're in my territory now," that handsome and extraordinary man arrogantly replied. "Guardian?" Yi Shiwen recalled the information he had received in the past. People had a hunch that the great gas building might be some divine tool. However, nobody knew whether it was true or false. However, a person that used to claim himself as the great gas building's guardian would appear every time it opened. However, a different person would appear every time. Nobody knew about their background. Nobody even knew where they came from. These people were very mysterious. Moreover, each of them was extremely formidable. They were far more powerful than ordinary sage accomplished level experts. An expert of half-step great sage realm had once suppressed his cultivation and fought with one of these guardians. However, he had suffered a crushing defeat. Consequently, he had lost his motivation and the possibility of making progress in the future. These guardians were merely the experts of sage accomplished realm. However, they could often display fighting prowess that was far greater than that of an expert of sage accomplished realm. This was the dreadful aspect of these guardians. However, weren't these guardians only supposed to protect the great gas building? Why had one of them come out to interfere in someone else's business? These guardians also had some control over who would get the heritages of the great gas building. Therefore, one mustn't make these guardians their enemy when they meet them. In fact, one must try hard to be friends with these guardians so that they could obtain their favor regarding the heritages of great gas building. That's right. And I want you to stop this now. That young guardian's face exposed arrogance as he said. After all, he believed that Yi Shiwen must follow his orders in an obedient manner. Don't you have any other thing to do? Why are you meddling in someone else's matter? Yi Shiwen looked at him maliciously and said, "How dare you say that I'm meddling in other people's matters? Very well, I am expropriating your eligibility for the heritages." The young guardian's face looked sinister as he said, "That you're tuning in to the Passion Pages YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.